Greetings to you all. The Vampire Cop series is, was, and will always be my saving grace. For those who have been clued up with the series, you may navigate to the last part of the story, which is the finale. Since there are so many chapters in the video, I have put the timestamps for each part in the comments. And for those who are new, I have compiled the entire series into one video. If you can get through the first part, which was the first time I have written and narrated such a long story with all the nerves and anxiety, my subscribers and I can assure you it only gets better from there. If you enjoyed the story or even the character, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Until the next one, do take care. Fesliyan Hunt remained the age of 35, while technically being 102 years old. Ages ago, the man was a locksmith, and the first victim turned by Gilroy the Higher Vampire in the massacre that took place at Redwater. Fesliyan had lived this dark, gloomy, and gruesome life with this curse that he never asked for. In fact, the man wished that he could be part of the group that never saw tomorrow. His thirst for blood, the mistakes that he made, and the life that he led seemed like a really long nightmare that one could not wake up from. The most beautiful witch in all of Redwater, not just in her looks but her personality, had rescued him from the depths of insanity and showed him the path that he was destined for. Fesliyan fell in love with Myra, and in the process she did too. But relationships between vampires and witches were forbidden, as natural law feared the unpredictable nature of a vampire witch offspring. But now, as he woke a few minutes after sunset, he played back the events of the past week. While having fought many werewolves in his lifetime, this was the first time that Fesliyan had encountered one that could talk. The vampire saw the werewolf as someone that he could trust. There was a belief that Fesliyan had. Irrespective of how one looked, fairest of them all, or a monster incarnate with red eyes and sharp teeth, it was the soul that mattered, and the soul of Victor the werewolf seemed righteous and pure. Fesliyan brushed his teeth and fangs, and then opened a cupboard that occupied blood bags from wounded animals that could not be saved at the local vet. He emptied the bag in a mug like an ordinary human that drinks tea or coffee when waking. Mrs. Armanai, the veterinarian in Redwater, is one of the few that know of the vampire secret. Absolutely terrified and baffled at first, the middle-aged doctor warmed up to the vampire cop in no time. Fesliyan Hunt speaking. How may I be of assistance? Captain Langley was on the other end of the call. I have a case for you, Fesliyan. One that may sound strange at first, but I need you on this ASAP. You sound tense, Captain, Fesliyan said. What is it? Werewolves. Fesliyan frowned as the call continued. Inspector Holt and Inspector Lincoln have been working a case in Houndsville, Lullaby Town. Missing persons case, and those who were found so far were mangled beyond belief. Some were even unrecognizable. The witnesses, while too traumatized to give proper details, mentioned some victims were devoured whole by a werewolf deep within the woods at night. Holt said that the bodies they found had their hearts removed, or more like ripped out. Inspector Lincoln's telephonic report seemed frightening to say the least. Vivian Lincoln never usually loses her wit. You, of all people, know this. There was no such thing as werewolves, or so they believed, until Holt saw one for himself. Now, Fesliyan, I'm still getting used to the fact that you're a vampire and werewolves exist in my world. But Inspector Lincoln and Holt did not give a third report. It's been 2 days later, and I understand, Captain, and I will take care of it. Fesliyan, the captain said in a much more softer, concerning tone. I hope you know that I trust you. Your loyalty and hard work has proved to me that you are on our side. I hate having to only call you to work cases like this, but The vampire respectfully interrupted. "No explanation needed, sir. This is what I signed up for. Farewell, Captain. I shall leave for Lullaby Town at once." But when Fesliyan hung up the phone, he had an expression of being lost in thought. Holt and Lincoln were much senior than Fesliyan was in terms of joining the Redwater police force, and they weren't pushovers in any sense of the term. So why were they out of their jurisdiction? And why did the captain sound different than his usual self? The vampire kept his secret hidden from the rest of the police force and the public by using excuses that caught up to him. Painted his face on Halloween night, and it hasn't come off since, no matter how much he tried to scrub it. An incorrect diet, and the ceiling caved in and fell on his face. Sometimes he would say that he was so drunk, and that is the reason why his eyes turned yellow. Excuses that no one would really believe, but he was thankful that his condition has improved over time. The ordinary folk knew of elves, dwarves, and witches, but vampires and werewolves were always kept a secret just to prevent mass panic. But the vampire stuck to one excuse that seemed to be plausible to the ordinary folk: a skin allergy from being sensitive to sunlight, which killed two birds with one stone, really. It explained why he looked so pale and why he only worked the night shift. Fesliyan hoped that he could use that excuse as long as possible until he would have to come clean about who he was. But for now, two of his seniors were missing and bodies were being dropped in Houndsville. The vampire walked down to his basement and turned the light on, which revealed his collection of books and knowledge obtained during his long life. Knowledge about every supernatural being that he had encountered or heard of. Then he shed just a little more light from his lantern, which displayed an arsenal of weapons. Swords, axes, poisonous darts, crossbows, wooden stakes, and many more. But the bigger weapons will not be needed this time. Instead, the vampire cop packed his crossbow with silver arrows, silver brass knuckles, long thick silver chains, and his trusty firearm with one silver bullet, only one. Fesliyan never needed weapons, but it did make the job much quicker than usual. As he waited outside his cabin for the 10 p.m. train, he played back the events described by his captain. There was mention of only one werewolf, but for some reason, the vampire felt like there may be a pack involved. Now the question was, were they natural-born werewolves, or the cursed ones? Fesliyan boarded the 10 p.m. train as the conductor greeted him warmly with a kind nod of the head gesture. This would be a 2-hour ride from Redwater all the way to Lullaby Town. The vampire in his cop suit, pale skin, and slicked back hair stared out the window. The dark and foggy night had a quietness to it. If you were an ordinary human. But faintly, Fesliyan's hearing stretched miles further, and in the distance, just over the mountain, he heard it. A pack of werewolves howling, followed by one deep, menacing, and terrifying roar. Despite the vampire being so fast that he appeared as a blur, or so powerful that even while holding back, he gave the special class werewolf Victor a run for his money. Fesliyan needed to be on this train. If at any moment he paused for a breath and someone saw him running, then his masquerade as a normal human would all be in vain. Besides, running with a suitcase was a definite no. The time passed by quickly as he bid farewell to the conductor, midnight sharp. He carried his belongings and walked slowly yet carefully into the town, as the grieving folk all stared at his broad shoulders and pale skin. Accommodation was priority. It would be sunrise in 5 hours and 45 minutes, give or take, and he needed lodging before that. The folk were kind enough to let him stay in the house at the end of the street. The townfolk cautiously had exited their homes to meet the vampire cop. No one slept that night, and how would they when the poor souls lived in fear? They were too distraught to notice the unusual scary nature of the cop that stood in front of them. The vampire cop gave an invitation to the folk of Lullaby Town to enter his lodgings an hour after sunrise if they had any information worth sharing. But for now, he urged them to try and get some sleep. In the 5 hours and 35 minutes now remaining, Fesliyan walked towards the woods when he heard 2 werewolves scurrying away in the distance. This massacre was orchestrated. So without fear, the vampire decided to enter the woods of Lullaby Town to investigate. Heavy footprints sunken into the ground. The smell of soaked fur either from the previous night's rain or from blood. 2 sets of police boot prints looked like a size 5 and a size 9. The same size that described Inspector Lincoln and Holt respectively. Fesliyan continued the path as he used his heightened senses to piece the massacre together. Towards the middle of the woods, the footprints were many and smudged. People ran for their lives, tripped, and fell over and over again. There was a saying in the supernatural world: never venture the woods at night. The trees held all the pain and the bloodshed that took place, and if you listened carefully, you would hear the victims' agonizing screams. Indeed, they were werewolf prints, but that wasn't the scary part, at least not to Fesliyan. Footprints of wolves on all fours, then giant bipedal footprints. This was something more troublesome. This had indicated the natural-born werewolves that walk on all fours and cursed werewolves that are bipedal were now working together. For as long as the vampire lived, the 2 classes have never mingled with each other. Furthermore, the lacerations, torn limbs, and devouring people whole, that was normal werewolf behavior. But removing the heart from each victim, that was a ritual killing. The vampire cop knew that the rest of the victims weren't missing. They were dead. No one was foolish enough to venture so far into the woods, day or night. Then, as Fesliyan walked deeper into the woods, he saw them. Inspector Holt lying against the tree trunk, his torso missing, right arm torn off, and his heart ripped out from his chest. Inspector Vivian Lincoln was nowhere on the ground, rather much higher up into the tree, as if the werewolf tossed her lifeless body. Her neck was gashed so deep that her head dangled over the branch. She too had her heart removed. The rest of the victims lay spread out throughout the woods. Same style of murder. The vampire cop figured the missing limbs were just meals for the werewolves. Tears rolled down his face as he saw the loss of human life. So much of torture and bloodshed. Men, women, and even the pets that people kept. Finally, he walked back into town and then delivered the painful message. This was one part of the job that he hated to his core. The vampire cop suggested something that may have sounded harsh, but his intention was good. "Please, burn the woods when I leave," he said. "There is too much of bloodshed to retrieve your loved ones. My fellow comrades also lay there, and it pains me that I cannot take their bodies back to Redwater. I am truly sorry for your loss." The grieving townfolk all burst into tears and screams when Fesliyan put his head down. Perhaps this gesture was out of respect, or the fact that he became a bearer of bad news. Some struggled and tussled with others just to fetch the bodies of their loved ones, and had even entered the woods, but their screams shortly after had echoed throughout the night. How do you bring back bodies when limbs were scattered everywhere? Just before sunrise, Fesliyan made his way to his lodgings, pulled a wooden chair with his back facing the window and the curtain blocking out any bit of sunlight. Majority of the townfolk were too traumatized. They entered their homes and never came out. Those who mustered the courage had entered Fesliyan's home by standing in a group that was huddled in front of him. One by one, the statements began. There were 2 police inspectors, a man and a woman, that entered the town the night before the massacre. They said they got word of a missing persons case, which was strange since No one was actually missing yet, nor did we call them. Then, at midnight while we slept, we heard people being dragged out their homes. Despite the darkness in this town, we all looked out for each other. The rest of us stormed outside with the weapons in hand, and then we froze. 2 monstrous and vicious werewolves dragged 20 of our people into the woods. We heard their flesh and bone being ripped and snapped, their blood-curdling screams, and how they begged for it to stop. Some of us fetched the kids and took them to safety, whereas others charged into the woods and never came out. By the time the 2 inspectors reached, the night was dead silent. They looked spooked coming out. In Houndsville, we know that werewolves exist, but somehow we felt like it was the first time the inspectors saw one for themselves. We had also figured that maybe the full moon caused them to act out, but we were wrong. The second night was a repeat of the first, and we had anticipated that. Those that never believed us remained near the woods. The werewolves took maybe 10 more people this time. That's when the inspectors charged forward. Gunshots were heard, but they never came out. Now, sir, I know what you might be thinking, that why don't we relocate, but where do we go? Especially with our children. This is Houndsville. There are werewolves lurking at every corner. Fesliyan asked, "Can you describe these werewolves to me? This might sound really weird, but did you hear them speak?" No. But they were massive, much taller than you, and they had this troublesome rage to them, with constant drool that dripped from their mouths, kind of like rabies. There were a few more that were hiding in the woods. We saw their eyes glow, but they were at a normal wolf height. Since it was dark, we couldn't really be sure, but maybe those were normal wolves. Then there was a moment of silence. Silence filled with the realization of how many people they have lost. Until a brave girl pushed through the crowd. Fesliyan woke up from his chair and then crouched on the floor in front of her. In her quaky voice she said,
"I saw her. The old decaying woman with long wavy white hair. She entered the town late at night, and I caught a glimpse of her through the bathroom window. She had a walking stick and walked hunched and slowly, and then out of nowhere the old lady vanished into a puff of smoke."
Then a member from the group pulled the girl behind and apologized on her behalf for her nonsensical statement. But Fesliyan warmly interrupted. "Little one," he said, "was this before or after the werewolves had entered the town?" The girl replied, "Before." The vampire cop smiled at her, hiding the look of sheer worry on his face. "What do we do?" the townfolk asked Fesliyan. "They will come for us tonight as well. Where do we go? How do we survive?" The vampire cop could see how afraid they were that they began trembling. And then he said, "All of you will remain in your homes and have your doors locked." His tone was calm and comforting, with a vague smile of assurance, like everything was going to be okay. "No werewolf will harm you tonight, but may I just say that whatever you hear, do not leave your homes." As the townfolk left to enter their homes and lock their doors, Fesliyan's warm smile slowly turned into a frown. To the outside world, they never knew the troublesome thoughts that swam around in the vampire's mind. Cursed and natural-born werewolves were working together, removing the hearts of victims in a ritual style of murder, and the old lady with a walking stick and white wavy hair had implied that she was one of the crones. If the vampire did not stop the werewolves by the upcoming nightfall, the entire town would serve as sacrificial lambs. But why did Holt and Lincoln show up at a town before anything happened? No one called them. There was no reason for concern in the first place. It was still morning. The long wait was torturous indeed, and the vampire hoped for cloud cover to come sooner than later. Fesliyan grabbed the silver chain from his suitcase and wrapped it around his body, right shoulder to left waist. He carried 6 silver arrows in his belt and loaded one in his crossbow, which was then placed on the inside of his long black coat. These werewolves needed to suffer, not just for Holt and Lincoln, but every innocent person's life that was taken. The long wait finally came to an end as night fell. Fesliyan walked out the house slowly as he checked if any townfolk remained outdoors. The vampire re-entered the woods with an expressionless face. His steel-toe boots knocked against the ground as he heard the werewolves approaching. More than two this time. The sound of too many to count. The dark, menacing clouds gathered over the entire town. The rumbling thunder in the sky as the clouds released slow and steady droplets of rain just before the downpour. The werewolves tried to move silently, but Fesliyan's hearing stretched to such an extent of being able to hear them breathing. The vampire cop's eyes turned blood red as he took a deep breath. The natural-born werewolves had surrounded the vampire cop. Their wet fur and foul breath stung his nose with disgust and anger. They growled at Fesliyan, pouncing and then retreating, trying to frighten him, but his eyes were fixed in front. 4 monstrous, vicious, and terrifying cursed werewolves walked towards him, but there were 2 more that flanked the woods for a sneak attack. They were quick and agile. It seemed like the natural-born werewolves were just a mere distraction. They couldn't speak, not like Victor, but it didn't mean that they weren't smart. In fact, the 2 werewolves that fled earlier went to get a larger pack. Supernatural beings knew power scaling, and sending only 2 werewolves to deal with Fesliyan would have been a dumb choice. Much further stood the Alpha. It did look like it had rabies, much bigger than the rest, and its rage and evil nature showed on its despicable expression. The Alpha watched carefully, but there was no time to waste. Fesliyan yanked the long silver chain from his body and swiftly swung it around him, wiping out the smaller natural-born werewolves with one swipe. Their fur sizzled as the chain made contact. Some were gashed in half, while the others had their necks broken. The 2 werewolves that flanked him were shot with silver arrows in their necks. Their charge immediately came to a halt as the silver spread throughout their body. Fesliyan's movements were so fast, just a mere blur of red and black to the naked eye. The pack of 4 werewolves in front of him dispersed. 2 of them viciously charged at Fesliyan, and their speed was impressive. The Alpha remained behind, watching all this unfold as his steps were slow and steady, way too confident in his capabilities. The next pair of werewolves leaped from behind Fesliyan, an attack that would definitely work. The only place for the vampire cop to run would be towards the sides. Indeed, the werewolves were extremely quick, but they were at a disadvantage. The rain helped Fesliyan, for wet fur weighed the werewolves down, making them slower. The vampire cop dealt with the 2 in front, snapping his silver brass knuckles onto both fists, right cross to the face, and a left hook to the body, respectively. The blows packed so much of power behind them that it ripped out chunks of flesh from the werewolves as it dismantled them. A swift turn behind and those 2 werewolves met the same fate, but this time there was a barrage of punches, high, low, middle, no distinctive pattern, which made it difficult for the werewolves to read. He turned them into minced meat. The vampire cop took a deep breath as he wiped the blood and fur from the brass knuckles onto his coat and pants. His focus was on the Alpha, but he had to be careful. This was the cursed werewolf that had the answers. Fesliyan walked slow and steady towards him as he swung the chain side to side and around his body. The Alpha's pace hastened, thunderous footsteps in succession, and then rapidly accelerated. He was much more powerful than the other werewolves. This rage, this madness, was somewhat terrifying. Finally, it leaped through the air as its eyes glowed yellow. The werewolf's sharp claws shined in the night. The grunting and the growling noises that it made was so loud, it rumbled the windows of the houses in the town. And just before impact, Fesliyan had remembered something. The vampire cop shot the werewolf with his one trusty silver bullet, a special coating, a recipe of an ointment if you will, that wouldn't kill the cursed werewolf but change him back into his human self, courtesy of Myra. The werewolf held its knee as it winced in agony. The transformation back to its human self was rapid and painful. Fesliyan said, "Why should you get a fair fight when the innocents that you have slaughtered were helpless? You too shall meet the same demise." Before the full transformation could revert, the vampire dashed towards the wolfman as he beat him to a pulp. Every overpowered punch, kick, elbow and knee were for the innocent lives that could not fight back. Fesliyan broke the wolfman's elbow, twisted it, causing torturous pain as he punched the face repeatedly while interrogating him. Sadly, the wolfman gave very little information on the matter, but a shocking reveal had indicated that the werewolves were tasked to kill Fesliyan tonight. Fesliyan snapped the wolfman's neck and tossed him onto the ground, like a person throwing a pillow on the bed. No remorse, no hesitation whatsoever. A few more werewolves stormed the woods and saw their alpha lifeless. Then the vampire cop dealt with them swiftly. As Fesliyan walked out the woods, he passed the bodies of those who lost their lives. This was part of the woods that needed to be burned, so he dragged the werewolves that he massacred much deeper to the parts that won't be burned. The vampire cop used his long silver chains to hang the werewolves from trees. Cursed or natural born, he never cared. This was a message to all the werewolves in Hounsville that a vampire was here. Not a measly, weak or political vampire, but a vampire that fought for those unable to defend themselves. This was a punishment that fit the crime they have committed. The orphans these werewolves have made, the mothers, fathers and siblings they have snatched away. No, this part of the woods will not be burned. He wanted the werewolves to rot. The people of Lullaby Town stood in awe as they watched Fesliyan exit the woods. They knew that he was a vampire, and he never felt the need to lie to them in this time of peril. They thanked him and heeded his call to burn the woods. Fesliyan used his heightened speed to pour gasoline everywhere. When he walked out, he told all the townfolk to light wooden torches and throw them in one by one. This was a form of cremation to the ones lost. Surely not a proper send-off, but the best that could be done with the circumstances at hand. The townfolk cried, said their prayers, while Fesliyan saluted to the deceased, Holt and Lincoln. The vampire then bid the townfolk farewell. Just before leaving the town, the brave little girl that told Fesliyan of the crone walked to him, hugged his leg, and gifted him her pink teddy bear. The vampire refused many times, but the girl insisted. Therefore he accepted it and wished her a safe and long life. The vampire cop boarded the 10 p.m. train with a heavy heart. The trip back was completely the same as the first. So many questions, so many troublesome thoughts, all in such a short space of time. Why would a crone work with werewolves? Why would werewolves team up with others outside their pack? The air on the way back felt much darker and fouler than usual. Maybe it was the anxiety and fear of the unknown. When he returned home, there were two things to do. 1. Find out why Captain Langley sent him, Lincoln and Holt on a suicide mission. And 2. Find out about the ritual of collecting hearts. It was midnight as the vampire walked down to the basement. He removed his coat and tie and hung it on the nail knocked into the wood near the stairs. This was going to be an even longer night than he expected. Fesliyan searched his entire library. So many books of rituals and sacrifices that he wasted much time flipping through pages and then keeping the irrelevant books on the floor. And finally he found it. This ritual book was old and fragile. He glanced at the chapters looking for something specific. The werewolves could have devoured the entire town at once, but the witnesses mentioned a specific number of people being taken every night. There it was, the awakening ritual. On the first night, 20 hearts need to be collected from the innocent, 10 on the second night, third night, 19. An odd number indeed, but for a specific reasoning. The 20th heart on the third night needed to be of a vampire. There was mention of the crone with white wavy hair and a walking stick. That didn't help much since crones changed their appearances and their voices all the time. So 50 hearts in total, but what is she trying to awaken? More importantly, is that why the captain used Holt and Lincoln as scapegoats, knowing fully well that Fesliyan will run to their aid? The captain clearly knew the massacre was going to take place. Was he working with the crone? Absolutely furious at the betrayal, the vampire stormed upstairs. He was meant to call the captain when he returned, but Captain Langley was never expecting that call in the first place. And just before heading out the door, the phone rang. It was Inspector Mills. Fesliyan was so outraged that he came off as rude, telling the inspector that he was on his way to see Captain Langley. But Mills, in her soft, heartbroken voice, told him that won't be possible. Captain Langley was murdered 2 nights ago. But how? The vampire couldn't speak properly. They never had Fesliyan's number, hence the delayed call. Mills said Fesliyan's name repeatedly, but the vampire had dropped the phone. If Langley was dead, then who did Fesliyan speak to last night?
Are you afraid of the dark, my dear?
It had been 10 minutes since Fesliyan hung up the phone. Shocked and confused about the details of the call, there was a gentle knock on the door of his wooden cabin. Inspector Laura Mills paced around impatiently on the wooden porch. Her nerves kept her fingers moving and rubbing against each other. This was the first time that a fellow inspector had visited Fesliyan's home. The vampire cop with his slick back hair, white long-sleeve shirt rolled up to his thick forearms and a black vest over, opened the door and welcomed Inspector Mills into his home. But sunrise was nearing. "Please have a seat, Inspector Mills. I was just on my way to see you." Did something else come up? Miss Laura Mills looked at the vampire head to toe, but focused greatly on the man's face. "There's a story that I wish to share with you," she said.
Long ago, in the dark, misty woods of Redwater, a terrifying monster brutally attacked an elderly man, ripped him to complete shreds. The monster was reddish in color, with a mane like a lion, yet looked much like a wolf creature. The fiend then turned its attention to a little girl in the woods as it chased her down. Its footsteps so loud it vibrated the very ground the girl walked on. She ran for her life until a mysterious man came to her rescue. A pale man with red eyes, wearing a leathery black coat, sleeves rolled up to his forearms, and black jeans. Hair slicked back, but shorter than yours. He moved so quick that if you blinked your eyes, the mysterious being would disappear. The reddish wolf-like creature, with a mane, roared at him from the top of the trees. A legendary battle took place, and what started off as a fair fight soon changed course as the battle dragged on. The mysterious man had these razor-sharp fangs that showed every time he grunted. His muscles, visible through the clothing, overpowered the fiend in the woods of Redwater. Punches, throws, kicks, he did it all. Alas, the man stood firm, feet planted in the ground, donning a stance ready for the second round. But the wolf-like monster scurried away, disappearing in the mist, never to be seen again. That man saved me that day.
The sun had risen, and Fesliyan stepped into the corner of his cabin, hiding in the darkest of shadows, trying to act normal. Inspector Mills sat upright on the wooden chair looking at the vampire's weird behavior when she continued.
That was 30 years ago. I was the little girl in the woods that night. I've aged, and yet you remain the same.
Fesliyan, while looking down at the wooden floor, said, "Forgive me, madam, but it seems to be some sort of mistake."
You didn't recognize me when you joined the Redwater Police Force, but I recognized you. I wanted to thank you for such a long time, but I didn't know how to. With researching academia from witches in Redwater, I pieced it together. Back then, I never saw a man with such speed, only working the night shift, sustaining wounds shown at the precinct, and magically healing the next day. The skin condition excuse can only take you so far. You're a vampire.
Fesliyan was nervous as he has ever been. His body language never showed it, but it was visible in his eyes. Once again, he said, "Forgive me, Inspector Mills, but I really think that you have the wrong person. Though I am really glad that you made it out safely."
You're right. Maybe I am mistaken. Or maybe you could prove that to me by stepping out of the shadows and into the sunlight.
The vampire remained speechless with a look of defeat on his face. Mills told Fesliyan how she would now be captain, and former Captain Langley's death would be investigated by her. For now, the woman's visit wasn't just to thank the vampire, but to inform him the beast has now returned to Redwater. Except there was only one problem with that. The vampire hid this from Captain Mills to avoid panic, further questions, and digging deeper into a world that she would not fathom. Fesliyan Hunt actually chased down that beast and killed it the next day. The lichen breed ended off with that same creature. So, who or what was this crimson lichen that after all these years has now shown up in Redwater? The vampire's secrets piled on. How could he tell Mills that a person posing as Captain Langley sent him, Holt, and Lincoln on a suicide mission just to get his heart for a ritual? The way that he saw it was that once the Crimson Lichen is exterminated again, then he would personally investigate Captain Langley's imposter. Fesliyan would farewell to Captain Mills and walk down to his basement headquarters as he approached the library. The pink fluffy teddy bear was kept neatly on one of the shelves. This was the only physical gift that he had ever received in his long life. No shame in displaying it. But he was looking for a specific book, one that he wrote himself, more like a journal really. When he hunted down the lichens, he recorded everything he observed, since there were no such thing as lichens previously. The pile of books was still on the floor from the previous night, and this hurt Fesliyan's soul. The man never sat well with being untidy. As he packed the books away neatly, he finally found the journal. Lichens in this particular fantasy world share some traits with werewolves, but are quite different. The name lichens came from the term lycanthropy, which is the condition of people believing they are wolf-like creatures. In their human form, they would behave as such, walking on all fours, howling, grunting, hunting animals and people like wolves, almost developing a different personality that consumed their mind by providing them false validation as the truth. Now, when it comes to mythology, most of them transformed using a magical belt or a wolf pelt. I say transformed because all this did was amplify the cannibalistic tendencies in their human form. In this timeline, however, their change was much different. Long ago, especially during the winters, the crones would take advantage of the weak-minded people. With the food resources being scarce, many became cannibals, giving them that illusion of being something more than human. But feeling a certain way is one thing. Looking the part solidifies one's beliefs. These humans were given cursed oil by the crones, which allowed their transformation to last for 6 hours at any given moment in time. Lichens, unlike werewolves, can be male or female. They retain their human nature and some facial features but cannot speak. Their bodies are enlarged, their skin is tightly wrapped, with no fur except for the actual head. The first and oldest lichen worked and overlooked the operations for the crones, hunting and preying on victims, convincing them to change just to cause chaos and bloodshed. Redwater had a cave dungeon in which these monsters were being created every day. Luckily, the vampire, before becoming a cop, tracked down the dungeon and exterminated the lichens. The only one that gave him some form of trouble was the Crimson Lichen. Lichens weren't usually red, but rumor had it the man used the cursed oil so many times with no break to heal that it damaged his skin permanently. This beast was faster, stronger, and lost his human self completely. Couldn't use silver because they weren't actual werewolves. Therefore, Fesliyan Hunt used his incredible speed and vigorous power by ripping out the lichen's spine, killing it immediately. Furthermore, The vampire burned down the Lycan dungeon, including the indigenous rock which the crones used to extract the oil from. As strange as this world was, werewolves, vampires, witches, elves, dwarves, monsters, demons, and everything in between, things coming back from the dead, was not normal in any world. The vampire passed the time by refueling on 8 cups of blood, as he would need all the strength that he could muster to fight this beast. Fesliyan Hunt waited for sunset and set off to a town in Redwater that spotted the Crimson Lycan. The vampire cop, dressed in his comfortable long black coat, walked into the town of Landy. With each step he felt suffocated. This was one of the worst towns in Redwater, one that he was ashamed of. Landy was part of the richer places in Redwater. Spectacular architecture of old homes and buildings. Streets were clean for the most part, and the work life dominated the area. But the people in the town were awful. They were richer than most, therefore felt the need to look down upon somebody with a lesser job. This place was filled with snobbish, judgmental, and cold-hearted folk that not once tried to help the needy. First things first, Fesliyan ignored all the townfolk for now at least. He made his way to the secret cave entrance to see if somehow the dungeon had been rebuilt and if these Lycan monsters were really back. The vampire cop had entered the cave and the stench of sulfur stung his nose. Lycans never smelled like sulfur, which piqued the vampire's suspicion, but he waited for the person behind him. Fesliyan knew that Mills was following him. Her perfume could be smelled a mile away, but he reassured her that he was more than capable of handling the case himself. Besides, the vampire never wanted her in any danger. Captain Mills left the scene, and Fesliyan continued the path. The foul smell of sulfur never left the cave no matter how deep the vampire delved in. The first thing that came to mind, it had to be a demon. Finally, the vampire cop reached the end and saw candles lighting up the cave. Someone had definitely been in this place meddling with something they shouldn't have, but there was some sort of relief. Fesliyan's eyes lit up red, rapidly scanning the area. Good news was the dungeon part was still burned down. The rock producing that cursed oil was still destroyed. Now, the vampire cop moved on to the streets. Fesliyan sat on a wooden bench in the middle of the town with a pencil and a notepad in hand. The few genuine folk in Landy approached him and gave their statements. First one was by a woman with short, messy hair.
It all started a few nights ago. There was a girl wearing a red hooded cloak wandering the streets of Landy. She clearly looked like a village girl, but she wandered the town aimlessly like she was drunk. Some said her eyes were changing color, red to yellow whenever she blinked. I also saw her enter the cave behind the town, and the girl never came out. Ever since then, the Crimson Monster showed up.
Thank you kindly, Fesliyan said. If I may, did this girl with the red hood smell like sulfur? The woman shook her head and said,
Nope. Well, I don't know. She was too far away for me to notice. Why?
Fesliyan Hunt smiled vaguely and gently shook his head. Thank you, he said, that will be all. The next person that walked up to him was a middle-aged man with fear all over his face. The man told Fesliyan how he wasn't from Landy, rather a village from Redwater. His trip brought him here in search for a girl commonly known as Red Riding Hood. Since that day in the forest, everything changed. The girl began crawling on the ground in an unnatural, creepy manner. This happened late at night, but the man worked the night shift, therefore spotted it many times. Red Riding Hood's peculiar behavior continued for weeks. Sometimes the girl would light tiny fire pits and write strange symbols on the ground. The village folk called the priest, and the next thing they knew, the Red Riding Hood disappeared, taking the stench of sulfur with her. Sadly, the man found the girl's body 2 days before, located in the cave below. Red Riding Hood's bones were broken and the girl wasn't breathing anymore. The village folk were called in and performed the girl's last rites. The vampire cop expressed his condolences to the man. Fesliyan said, "Thank you for your statement, good sir. I hope peace and clarity finds the hearts of you and the rest of your village. "Excuse me, good sir, but I will take your leave now." When the man walked away, the vampire's eyes glowed red once again. His ears moved a little, like an antenna trying to pick up a signal. He kept the notepad and the pencil back in his coat pocket, and then stood up. Why was the panicky vampire making his way through the alleyway? His footsteps quickened, looking side to side and behind him each time. His body tensed, and he sniffed at each corner that he passed. The smell of sulfur had come back. Where was it coming from? The bright lights behind him weren't enough to help him spot the beast. Fesliyan could hear it moving, but the noise in the town didn't make things easier. The vampire could not use his heightened senses. Fesliyan walked towards the center of the town, concentrating harder this time. The vampire's heartbeat slowed right down, almost non-existent. His eyes followed the sound slow and steady. Then he heard it. Roof tiles. The crimson lichen ran on the rooftops, stalking the vampire cop as quietly as possible. The hunter became the hunted. How long was this beast hiding in the shadows, leaping from rooftop to rooftop? But round one of cat and mouse soon came to an end. The crimson lichen hopped onto a rooftop with a bright light shining directly on it. The monster took a low, pouncing stance on one of the ledges and growled at the vampire. Some of the townfolk ran inside, while others witnessed the standoff. Fesliyan Hunt unholstered the two pistols from his belt, concealed by his long black coat. With the blood-red eyes that allowed him to see further, shot after shot was fired at the ledges, but the crimson lichen was just as quick. The lichen wasn't as fast as Fesliyan, but it did have extra grip on the ledges, evading and leaping from rooftop to rooftop with ease. Thus begins the epic chase between lichen and vampire. Fesliyan ran as fast as possible with his shoes slipping on the dampened paving, but he needed to get to the rooftop immediately. One massive leap and the vampire landed on one of the ledges. Fesliyan stumbled trying to catch his balance. The intense storm did not work in the vampire's favor. Keeping the fight on the rooftops and away from the townfolk was priority. At first glance it did look like the same lichen, but the eye can be deceiving. The lichen roared at the vampire cop, hissing, grunting, and drawing him in with each evasive maneuver. The game of cat and mouse had just entered its second round. Fesliyan ran alongside the lichen, firing shots, leaping from ledge to ledge and landing on the opposite side of the monster each time. With each leap, the vampire took a shot, but a heavy rain obstructed his speed and eyesight, causing the bullets to miss by a hair. The dust of the ledge puffed into the air from the removal of stone with each gunshot from the vampire's pistol. The lichen, however, was getting tired. This crimson beast knew the only way out was to leap towards the vampire cop head-on with a powerful swipe at Fesliyan's face. Fesliyan sensed this was the last thing the lichen could do and then challenged it. It was anyone's for the taking. One could zig instead of zag and the game would be over. The vampire cop ran with all his might and kicked off from the rooftop, soaring through the air. The crimson lichen, looking terrifying as ever with his large white eyes, unsheathed its sharp claws and jumped. But Fesliyan met him with a flying kick across the face. The crimson beast lost its balance mid-air and fell to the ground. Stumbling on its left leg and trying to regain balance with the right, the monster scurried away into the alley, away from the bright lights. Fesliyan Hunt landed gracefully as his long black coat flapped against the wind with the intense thunder and lightning behind him. One thing was certain, this was no ordinary lichen. It seemed weaker and slower versus 30 years ago. Or perhaps the vampire has gotten stronger over the years. Fesliyan kept his fists up and ready, left shoulder in front to defend any blow from the suspicious beast. Walking side to side, front and backwards, the vampire entered the alleyway. The crimson lichen stopped running and turned back, its eyes blood red, same like Fesliyan's. The beast stood tall and strong with his large veins popping out everywhere. The monstrous being prepared itself to sprint forward. The landy was empty. The townfolk ran indoors, too scared to even stand by the windows and witness the battle. They felt true fear. The crimson lichen leaped off a concrete block in the alley and gained momentum, galloping and running, roaring and grunting. 100 muscles popped up on its chest. Its dark black mane blew against the wind, its eyes glowing in the night. What a terrifying sight. Fesliyan the vampire cop wasted no time and did the same. His speed made him look like a blur, his glowing eyes a streak of red in the darkness, swift and elegant. The game of chicken now begins. On one end there were monstrous, heavy and thunderous footsteps, while on the other end, light, smooth, and filled with purpose to stop this beast head on. The crimson lichen was now inches away from the vampire. What would it do? Bite, scratch, punch, claw, stomp? The choices were many, but the execution was limited. Fesliyan stopped an inch away from the lichen, with his shoes skidding on the wet paving coming to a halt, the same way that a horse would. He clenched his fists and held them in front of him. And there it was. The lichen chose to take a large swipe at the vampire. Its left muscular, heavy arm with sharp claws gave a glistening shine. But little did the beast know, before the claw even touched Fesliyan, 4 punches to immobilize the lichen. 4 powerful punches from the vampire at lightning speed with immense power. Fesliyan Hunt hit the crimson lichen at the pressure points the same way that he did 30 years ago. The beast stood at the far end of Fesliyan, panting. Its blood vessels began popping one by one. Its skin began boiling and the monster gradually shrunk. Fesliyan was right. This was no lichen. The beast melted down to an old, decaying evil man with murky orange eyes. The stench of rotten eggs from his body was disgusting. The frail man grunted and gave a cry, perhaps from the pain when shapeshifting, or the wounds inflicted by the vampire. Step by step, this mysterious being began shapeshifting. Its long, pointy ears began shrinking down to a normal human size. His hair began growing, while the man's opened mouth showed his rotten teeth. Fesliyan Hunt did not know what he was dealing with. The townfolk were hiding indoors, but if he let this unknown creature change into something worse, things could get catastrophic. The vampire sprinted and tackled the man, pushing them through a wall of an old church building. The wall crumbled into a pile of rubble. Fesliyan tumbled inside the church, while the decaying man remained behind the rubble at the door. There was a long wooden stake that pierced the vampire's foot. This was a wound that would slow him down. Therefore, the vampire grabbed the rope lying behind him on the wooden table to help him keep distance from this evil being. "Who are you?" Fesliyan asked angrily. The transformation was complete. The man had long gray hair, same orange color eyes, rotting teeth and skin with untidy facial hair.
I'm called many things, but my name is Archine.
The vampire tried walking forward but was stopped, dead in his tracks. The demon muttered something that kept the vampire cop from crossing the line. A dark, malicious spell. "You are the demon that cursed Victor."
Victor? Wow, you two already on first name basis. Moving a bit too quick there, bucko, but yes. What a disappointing failed creation he was. Come on, pull a chair and make yourself feel comfortable.
Fesliyan had no choice. He kept scanning the room, looking for ways to escape. Bullets won't work on demons. Why couldn't he remember anything from the books that he read? He clenched his hands tightly together in frustration while sitting down.
That's a good vampire. Fesliyan Hunt, if I am not mistaken. Your reputation precedes you, but I am not familiar with this nice guy act. I know you as the vampire monster that shed so much of blood it impressed a demon, like me. Oh yes, we both know what you were. Slaying bad guys or not, that gruesome, brutal and violent nature. You cannot hide from it. You could have killed me in the street back then, but you didn't. Trying so hard not to go back to the old ways. Embrace the darkness, my friend, embrace it. Let it consume you.
Fesliyan put his head down in shame. The vampire was indeed a brutal monster before becoming a cop. No matter how much he ran from that life, it kept coming back. What do you want from me?
Ooh, touch the nerve. I like it. We demons may be many things, but liars we are not. I want nothing from you but your time. You really think I was going to lose my time on Earth by getting into a fist fight with a vampire of your caliber? Especially when I'm this weak. I knew shapeshifting into a crimson lichen would draw your attention. A beast that you formerly slew has suddenly risen from the dead. What a plot. I should have been a writer. But seriously, my main job was to keep you away from the woods. The hellhounds are currently roaming free and they are hungry for werewolf. Monrax and Monrix, terrifying creatures from my master, will get rid of that pest Victor, and then I can continue my work. For all we know, they are already butchering him, ripping his flesh apart, chewing and devouring him whole. An inexperienced werewolf against those monsters? A death wish indeed. Oh, and how could I forget? So busy fighting me, you didn't catch the scent of jasmine in the air, did you? Your beloved witch is with Victor. That poor soul, which I don't mind taking, by the way, has no idea what she's in for. Those two are going to be minced meat in a few minutes, and the poor vampire's going to have to find another witch to screw.
Fesliyan's eyes turned red, burning with rage. Then he remembered a passage from a book. How true this was will soon be tested. There was a myth that lesser demons don't like water. Arkane remained in the same spot, not because he couldn't enter the church or climb the rubble. Some priests have done far worse things than demons, but there was a puddle of water in front of him from the leaking pipe above, and Fesliyan shut it. In his human form, the demon Arkane's skin began bubbling. Steam exited his body and he roared at the vampire.
What have you done?
The pipe sprayed water on the demon, and he vanished into a wisp of smoke, screaming in pain. The invisible barrier broke when Arkane left. The vampire ran at the speed of light to the woods in Redwater. His chest had the sinking feeling. What if Victor and Myra were dead? This was one time that he never cared if anyone found out his secret. The vampire reached the woods and saw the faint haze of purple dust. Arkane wasn't lying. It was unfortunate that Fesliyan never saw the bodies of the hellhounds in the distance. A few minutes sooner, and he would have known that Myra was in the Harrow, safe and sound thanks to Victor. A few minutes earlier, and the trio might have defeated the hellhounds much easily without any casualties. But Fesliyan stood in awe. The vampire cop witnessed a beast that instilled fear in his heart. A giant 8-foot-tall werewolf built like a brick wall, walking in the woods. Its eyes glowed blood red as it approached a tree trunk. Little did Fesliyan know, this monster was Ragnar the White Wolf. Fesliyan squinted his eyes to see Victor, the grey werewolf, lying on the ground unconscious. Stomach ripped open, flesh removed from his shoulder, and blood dripping from his nose. This giant monster walked towards Victor and picked him up. With so much of ease, like picking up a pillow and carrying it over one shoulder. Ragnar did so with Victor. As he was exiting the woods, the vampire charged at the werewolf at full speed. Fesliyan was a blur to the naked eye as his sharp 6-inch nails popped out. No matter how fast he ran, the vampire was always light on his feet. But this was no ordinary werewolf, and just before impact, Ragnar, without even looking, grabbed the vampire's neck, stopping him dead in his tracks. It was not just the mere speed of the werewolf, but his experience of anticipating an attack coming from a mile away. The grip pressure increased each time and a slow, painful crack of the neck was heard while Fesliyan grunted in pain. The white wolf slowly but carefully turned his head and looked at the vampire, squealing in agony. Ragnar then tossed Fesliyan aside like he was a mere insect. His back smashed against the rock on the ground, and the vampire was momentarily paralyzed. Could it be Ragnar snapping his neck from the choke, or the impact of the throw? Either way, Fesliyan Hunt would remain in this position for a long while having no feeling in his legs. The vampire cop had no choice but to helplessly watch this monster take Victor away while his body was trying to heal the damage as quickly as possible. In Fesliyan's mind, the largest werewolf that he had ever seen was responsible for the death of Myra the Witch and Victor the Werewolf. An understandable, unfortunate misunderstanding. Still, the vampire was lucky to live. Fesliyan Hunt slowly got up to his feet with moans and groans, but the vampire could finally move his legs and hands. It takes a really special being to be able to toss the vampire cop around. Fesliyan dusted his long black coat and massaged the stiffness and fuzzy feeling out of his neck. A weird, unusual, painful tingle ran down his spine. Once he composed himself, the vampire's fangs pushed out when he said, "Now I'm pissed." The pretty boy image that he had washed off his face in an instant. The vampire's eyes glowed yellow this time, as his face changed into something far more sinister. This was the power that he kept dormant for good reason. The respectful, chivalrous, kind and warm nature of Fesliyan Hunt as we know would now take a back seat. His old personality of being a ruthless vampire shall take over. The vampire dashed in front, leaping through the air. His body swirled in a tornado-like formation, turning the vampire into a wisp of dark smoke. In this manner, Fesliyan's senses are amplified, making him not only able to travel greater distances quicker, but also increases the radius of his smell and hearing. Once he caught the scent of Victor's blood, the vampire made haste. Fesliyan Hunt soaring through the air in a wisp of dark smoke, scanning the layouts and the environments using echolocation. This form that he had taken had its benefits. For one, sunlight would not bother him anymore. However, the longer he stayed this way, the longer he hated himself for it. This form brought out the darker side of the vampire. The downside was extreme cold temperatures would still kill him, vampire monster or not. Therefore, making his way to the land of Freya was a no-go zone. But while in flight, Fesliyan's ears caught a familiar sound, Myra's voice. With his heightened hearing, he heard her heartbeat. The witch was anxious, scared. Fesliyan Hunt made haste in finding her and located her in an old village. The vampire landed gracefully onto the ground and wondered what was Myra doing in the harrow and where did all these people come from. The witch ran to the vampire and hugged him as tightly as she possibly could. Myra then explained everything to Fesliyan. The werewolf arrived in the harrow, and while whatever he felt was absent from his eyesight, he saw maybe 100 townspeople roaming around in his village. The werewolf glanced behind the cabin and noticed the farm was untouched. Thank the gods, or there would be a repeat of what happened in the harrow 134 years ago. Outside his cabin stood a beautiful witch with long dark brown hair and a silky purple dress. The woman looked anxious, constantly biting her nails. And just before the werewolf could spot Fesliyan, the vampire ran past Ragnar, landing a punch packed with all his might. The white wolf remained standing, never stumbled, just slightly turned his head with the impact. It had been a long while since he had tasted his own blood. Fesliyan Hunt said, "Now we are even." Myra the witch saw the commotion and ran towards both of them, pushing the vampire. After everything that she explained, he still chose to attack the werewolf. Myra's crows provide her with information scattered throughout the land. She knew Ragnar took Victor to the land of Freya. Fesliyan Hunt then changed back to his usual self, the calm-natured, gentleman-like vampire cop. He adjusted his hair by pushing it back, making sure that it was neat and tidy. The townfolk from Redwater, now in the village of Harrow, stood in awe. Their legs trembled, their eyes flickered, their hearts raced. This was the first time they saw the White Wolf. Many people believed that he was a myth, just a spooky tale from folklore to frighten trespassers.
Forgive my friend here, he's impulsive sometimes. I panicked, okay? These were the hellhounds we were dealing with. I needed to get my people to safety, and I didn't think you were real. The Harrow has been vacant for so long, and so many of us thought you were a myth, and forgive me for the intrusion we had nowhere else.
You have 5 minutes to leave my home. I have no dealings with you, witch. I have always despised your kind.
Ragnar then pointed at Fesliyan.
As for you, insect, I would rub out your spine and beat you with it if they weren't children standing in the village. Know your place, boy. You vampires are like ticks that latch onto my soul.
Fesliyan pushed forward and so did Ragnar, but Myra stepped between them. The White Wolf would not repeat himself. All they had was 5 minutes. The hellhounds were dead. Therefore, the town in Redwater wasn't in any danger. Despite Ragnar walking away from the two and moving behind his wooden cabin, Myra continued explaining everything while following him. Fesliyan mentioned Arkane and how the demon stole him, and even tried getting rid of him, just to prevent him from helping Victor in the woods. Everything unfolded. Red Riding Hood, Victor's curse, the death toll in the woods caused by Arkane, Captain Langley's death, and the mysterious person impersonating him over the phone. Everything the vampire and the witch spoke of had suddenly given them a terrible, fearful feeling. The feeling and the realization that they were also being targeted, since they helped Victor. But their conversation was briefly interrupted. The townfolk screamed in horror as the ground trembled. Tremors in succession. Myra, with her panic-stricken voice, yelled, "Earthquake!" She screamed at the top of her lungs for her people to get to safety. Yet the White Wolf never moved. Instead, he closed his eyes, with a facial expression that one has when they receive the worst news possible. This ominous feeling returned, a feeling not unknown to Ragnar. It's been so long, but he remembered it now. The werewolf experienced the same exact feeling that he has now when he walked past that specific dungeon in hell. Still, he never moved. The witch and the vampire emerged from behind the cabin. Standing on the elevated land, they had better vision, overseeing the entire village of the Harrow. Fesliyan's eyes widened, trembling with fear. Myra stood frozen from what she was seeing, and yet Ragnar still never moved. His eyes remained closed, still the same facial expression. The White Wolf knew that is no earthquake. The ground shakes, the trees wither and the plants die. With every tremor getting closer and louder, the green pastured land had now become barren. A foul smell looms the air. Faint snorts, grunts, and growls are heard. Not all the hellhounds are dead. Monrog is here. Monrog knew exactly who the white fur belonged to. Now, the hound's eyes moved away from the folk in the village and switched between the trio in front of him. First and only target, Ragnar the White Wolf. All the tales told about him would soon be put to the test. Second was the vampire, easy work. The hellhound then moved his eyes to the witch and frowned. This particular difference was something Ragnar noticed. Why did Monrog look at them with the intent to kill, yet it wasn't the same for Myra? How strange. And just before the White Wolf could process what was happening, the hellhound lunged forward, charging towards him head-on and galloping at the speed of light. The White Wolf returned the maneuver, lunging off his feet and pushing forward. Fesliyan Hunt changed into a wisp of smoke, flanking Monrog. Myra levitated in the air with glowing purple eyes, while conjuring up a dark light matter orb between her hands. When Ragnar got closer, he knew that he was in the wrong position. The werewolf accepted his fate by forming an X with his forearms to withstand the blow. Monrog used his head literally and ran the werewolf with so much of force it sent Ragnar flying through the houses in the village. The White Wolf knew Monrog was strong, but this strong, no one would have imagined. The vampire crept up to the side and landed a barrage of lightning-quick punches all towards the ribs. These were powerful shots, make no mistake, but the reaction that Monrog gave was colder than a winter's night. The hound never retaliated, not at first. Rather turned his head slowly towards the vampire and looked at him. Fesliyan's eyes widened with shock and gradually lessened his punches, gently backing up. But Monrog took a swipe with his massive paw and sharp claws, tumbling and rolling the vampire onto the ground. Myra's projectile orb, big and powerful, reached the hound and hit him square in the face. Monrog backed up. The fuzzy purple dust made him sneeze. The hound had the same expression as earlier, looking at the witch without the intent to kill, this time however with annoyance, a warning to stay back. Why was the hellhound not going after Myra? Ragnar the White Wolf leaped through the air from miles away, landing on top of Monrog, mounting him and pummeling the top of his head. Punches, elbows, hammer fist, no fixed pattern. The hellhound tried shaking off the White Wolf, but couldn't anticipate the angle the next attack would come from. While the next moment only lasted for a millisecond, this had cost the werewolf his position. This was something that a former warrior knight should have known from his impressive resume of battle experience. Never take your eyes off your opponent. Ragnar picked up his head and noticed Myra standing from afar, sending projectile orbs one after the other, yet Monrog did nothing about it. Why was the witch important to the hellhound? The vampire finally stood up from the massive strike earlier and dusted himself off. And at that moment, the hellhound jolted his body to the right, making Ragnar lose balance and fall to the ground. The hellhound used his front legs and stood on Ragnar's chest, putting all of his weight onto the White Wolf. The werewolf coughed out blood with impact, but tried grabbing Monrog's head. The same manner that a fox would dive into the snow, the hellhound did the same on Ragnar's chest. A 600 kg beast repeatedly jumping and landing on the werewolf, crushing his sternum and ribcage with ease. Monrog's mouth opened wide, his gnarly sharp fangs inches away from Ragnar's face, ready to take his head off. The vampire ran so fast, it seemed that he literally teleported from point A to B. He used the side of his palm and hit Monrog in the throat, retreating the hound while making it cough. Ragnar used those few seconds to look at the vampire and nodded his head as thanks. The White Wolf barely crawled out. His lungs were punctured, but the werewolf gene had been slowly repairing the damage caused by Monrog. So maybe Fesliyan wasn't an insect after all, but he was still holding back. The vampire had an aura of immense power within him. This was something Ragnar noticed when they were in the woods of Redwater. Perhaps his kindness and warm nature was the cause of suppressing it. Myra further used this opportunity to cast a barrier around Monrog, the same way she enclosed the hellhounds in the woods of Redwater, lifting the hound up and then slamming him to the ground. The witch was powerful, way too powerful for a 29-year-old. This one tactic or move that she had done confirmed Ragnar's suspicion. Myra saw the werewolf staring at her but couldn't seem to return the gesture. Secrecy and lies behind those mesmerizing purple eyes. Of course, the purple spherical barrier surrounding Monrog never lasted, nor did it hurt him. This was more of an irritation or annoyance, and yet again never attacked the witch, rather growled at her menacingly as a final warning. Fesliyan charged at the hellhound again, but Ragnar, with blood in his mouth, exclaimed, "No, wait! Monrog's tactics were sly to say the least, making him seem distracted by something when in reality, he was more focused than before. In the corner of his eye, he saw the vampire running towards him and swung his body around in an instant, going in for a bite. This final move would have been the death of Fesliyan. Monrog's jaw and fangs were so strong and sharp that it didn't matter how quick or powerful one was, they would not be able to escape. A wounded Ragnar Leifsson used every bit of his speed, lunging forward, grabbing the vampire's long coat and pulling him back. But the werewolf had sacrificed a limb. Monrog latched onto the werewolf's arm and viciously shook its head, ripping the forearm clean off. The white wolf roared in pain, but still managed to land a powerful right hook to the hound, pushing it back further. The witch cast yet another shield, this time to protect, not harm, in front of Ragnar while she ran to the werewolf's aid. The vampire stood in front of them while constantly turning back to check on Ragnar, blood shooting out from his ripped arm, moaning in pain, and Myra trying to stop the bleeding. The werewolf's wounds would heal. Monrog didn't have poisonous glands, not like Monrig's, but with Ragnar being immobilized, the chances of the vampire and the witch surviving looked pretty glum. The night had come to an end. The townfolk hiding in their temporary homes looked at the sunrise in the distance, a chilly morning with a gentle breeze. Monrog needed to wrap this up. For a moment he had forgotten the cardinal rule. Supernatural beings like himself that do not belong on earth would soon fade in their strength the more time they spent. Then in the quiet morning, among the sounds of Ragnar grunting in pain, holding his arm, Myra talking to the white wolf, Fesliyan preparing to face the hellhound head-on, there were two more sounds that followed. First sound was a loud exertion of force muffled by a long beard, a large silver axe soaring through the air, spinning vertically and finally impaling the left side of Monrog's neck. Second was the sound of 3 arrows whistling by like wind. This was so quick that if one blinked they would miss it entirely. The arrows weren't fired at random or in panic, rather with precision targeting the pressure points. Berthold the dwarf, while holding his second axe, emerged from behind the houses in the village. Eleanor the elf then glided down the rooftops. Now, this was what an attack looked like of 100 years of experience working together. The elf and dwarf were a powerful, troublesome duo to deal with. Monrog moaned in pain, but when he tried to charge at them, he noticed that he was stuck, constantly jolting forward but being pulled back each time. Then, as the hound turned its head behind its body, he saw why he couldn't move. His tail was being held by none other than Victor the Grey Werewolf. Victor Humbridge looked different. He looked bigger, stronger, and filled with purpose. The confusion, conflict, and weakness that he had seemed to have departed from his body. The dilemma of still thinking that he was a human, an ordinary townsman trying to make a living, had now detached from his soul. This wasn't Victor the Doctor holding Monrog in place. This was Victor the Werewolf. Then he tightened the grip on Monrog's tail and swung the hellhound behind him. Monrog never fell injuriously, rather landed on all fours but skidded across the ground. The elf and dwarf by the sides of Victor respectively was then joined by the vampire and witch, but Myra's purple magical shield was still protecting Ragnar behind them. Laughable. Monrog chuckled and then spat out blood onto the ground while snorting his nose. He slammed the side of his neck to the ground, removing the axe and leaving a nasty wound. The hound then used its paw and swiped the arrows impaled to the side of his neck, snapping them off. In the heroes' minds they thought the tides have changed. But for Monrog this fight had just gotten interesting. Time to show his real power. Alas, the moment was ruined. Next to the hellhound, a fiery beam shot out, and the ground began crumbling, turning into a sinkhole. Zalzar, the higher demon, emerged from the hole and placed his hand on top of Mondrog's body. Then, as quick as snapping one's fingers, Zalzar and Mondrog disappeared into the sinkhole. All this happened in such a brief moment, but there were so many noticeable things. 1. Mondrog tried fighting off the teleportation process back to hell. 2. Zalzar caught a glimpse of the heroes standing united. And number 3. The same confused look Mondrog had when he saw Myra was the exact same expression Zalzar had when he looked at the witch. Once again, despite being in agonizing pain, the White Wolf noticed this unfold before his very eyes. While the allies regrouped, tended to Ragnar's wounds and made acquaintances, Zalzar and Mondrog arrived in Hell. The Hellhound was furious with the higher demon, but Zalzar was right in doing so. The wounds on Mondrog were gnarly and needed to be treated as soon as possible. While Mondrog stormed his dungeon and shut the door, Zalzar held a council. A group of petrifying, spine-chilling monsters and demons sat around a table in a large room. Zalzar wrote symbols on the wall which opened up a receiving line. The demon appeared as a hologram, standing in a magnificent, dark, spooky and eerie castle just north of Cascada. The Wizards of Three received the call the same way that we would on Skype or FaceTime. Zalzar's call was short and to the point when he said,
"Wake him up. I have work for him. He's summoned to the council meeting in 5 minutes."
Then the hologram disappeared. The Wizards of Three, old, cunning, and evil yet wise men, walked up the many flights of stairs of the castle. They made their way to the master bedroom and found a pale man lying on the bed with tubes and pipes joining to his body, like a patient in the hospital. The old wizards, Cornwood, Connolly, and Caleb, looked at each other in fear, deciding which one of them had to carry out the death wish task of waking up this mysterious person. How we would normally do rock, paper, scissors, the Wizards of Three decided using magic. They stood in a circle, held out their hand like they were trying to grab something, and 3 respective astral-like monsters were cast within the circle. The first astral monster that died means the wizard casting that projection loses. Cornwood lost and moved towards the bed. He then removed the tubes and pipes from the pale man's body, long siphon-like tubes that led right around the castle all the way to the dungeon below, filled with innocent people being drained of their blood. Cornwood felt his heart pounding against his chest. Sweat dripped from the sides of his forehead, which was constantly dabbed using his long robe. "Sire," he whispered. "Sire, you have been summoned." Connolly and Caleb hid behind the door, peeking through, watching this nerve-wracking moment unfold. "Sire," the mysterious pale man with his eyes still closed grabbed the neck of the wizard. His fingernails were long, pointy, and razor-sharp. Cornwood, while being strangled, still managed to spit out the words, informing the pale man of the council that he was summoned to. The wizards had left the room, perspiration all over their bodies from the dangerous encounter. Gilroy, the higher vampire, had awakened from his deep slumber of more than 50 years. The vampire walked to his old wardrobe, pulled out his long grey coat, similar style to what Fesliyan wears, donned his pants and a neatly ironed white shirt that had an upturned collar, his black boots, and walked out the room. The Wizards of Three bowed in respect or maybe fear, then opened a portal for him that led straight to hell. The foul and despicable creatures waited for Zalzar to begin. Monsters with ugly, sharp teeth, demons with rotting flesh and skeleton-like faces, vile and dirty creatures larger than the White Wolf himself, all conversed about the matters at hand. Zalzar spoke.
"That weasel Archine has made an awful mess. Now, I don't know whether he knew about the prophecy and still chose to create a werewolf in the woods of Redwater, or was he just a dumbfounded imbecile. Nevertheless, I was hoping that the Grey Werewolf died before he found allies, but we are running out of time. Ragnar the White Wolf has joined him, so has the Elf and Dwarf. There was also a vampire cop among them with troublesome power. Thankfully, the power is still dormant. It's only a matter of time before the trials commence. We cannot attack them head-on. The White Wolf is smart, he knows better. I fear that he will not leave the side of the Grey Werewolf. If the crones go after the Grey Werewolf, Ragnar takes them out. It's just too risky.
One of the monsters interrupted. But my lord, what about the Witch of Redwater? Shouldn't she be on our side?
Zalza replied, that's the reason the White Wolf wasn't at his best today. It's only a matter of time before they piece it together. But to answer your question, no, she isn't on our side despite
the next demon had interrupted. Why don't we all just walk the earth and get rid of them before the trials begin?
Zalza shouted at the monster, silence, you foolish creature. Do you know how difficult it is for the crones to help us roam freely? They are saving their strength to open the largest ever gateway from hell to earth, just so my army can enter all at once. By me saving Monrog today, I just pushed them back 1 week later.
Then a goblin-like creature that was so short he would have to jump to use the toilet stood on the table confident as ever when he interrupted.
My lord, I have the solution. So a few nights ago I had a dream, yeah? And I fought the White Wolf one-on-one. No weapons, just a fist fight. And the best part was that I won, yeah, exactly. So why not send me down there, eh? I can take care of him.
Everyone began speaking over each other, blurting out nonsensical solutions. The noise in the dungeon sounded like a fish market. All the demons and monsters were eager to tackle Victor's allies, the vampire, witch, elf, dwarf. But when it came to Ragnar Leifsson, except for the goblin, no one spoke. Then the sound of boots knocking on the floor was heard outside the dungeon door. Slow, steady, and confident. The doors opened slowly and Gilroy the Higher Vampire walked in. He said, I will take care of the White Wolf. The monsters in the dungeon gasped while widening their eyes. Gilroy looked around the room and laughed at how weak they all were. Zalza acknowledged him and then responded,
You and I have never seen eye to eye, but as per our agreement, only this one time we are working together. Make no mistake.
Make no mistake, demon. The Higher Vampire interrupted. There's one thing you seem to have forgotten. I do not take orders from the likes of you. Your memory fails you, demon. I've warned you before. If any of you cross my path on earth, I will rip you to shreds. It just so happens that our goals have intertwined. None of the demons in the dungeon moved. The fish market of a council turned into deafening silence. The soft-spoken, mysterious, eerie vampire has a reputation far exceeding the White Wolf. They call him Gilroy, the first ever vampire to walk the earth and the man responsible for turning Fesliyan hunt. The silence in the dungeon was surely fitting, for what this vampire has done make the crones and demons look like saints. No one in the council knew what Zalza offered Gilroy. Some things were better left unsaid to weaker demons. The Higher Vampire's job was a tricky one. Once and if the trials begin, no supernatural being living or dead could interfere. Rules. The crones will handle Victor, which saves them the trouble of exhausting their energy trying to get demons on Earth so soon. Ragnar will tackle the crones, then Gilroy will take him out. That was easier said than done when others could get in the way, like the elf, dwarf, witch, or vampire. There was no need for Gilroy to be briefed. The first ever vampire overheard Zalza explain everything to the council before he entered. The demon asked, "What will you do?" The Higher Vampire replied, "I have to separate them. That group is strong even for someone like me. Let's hope Ragnar kills the witch when he finds out who she really is. But we need to remove speed from the equation. In order for them to begin the trials, they need speed. We know those who aren't fast enough in their place never return. You speak of a vampire they have, hence I will begin with him. Zalzar asked, "When will you begin?" Gilroy ignored the demon, whistled, and walked away. It was unfortunate indeed. The paths of the higher demon and the vampire had crossed. Zalzar hated this man. He was far too powerful and unpredictable. All the murders he has committed, all the innocent people he tortured. Did this vampire really think by changing his name to Gilroy and sleeping for so long will wipe his history from the land? Zalzar was one of the few that remembered his name. His real name, Vlad Tebish, aka Dracula. The dark storm clouds looming over the Harrow burst with rain. The day was silent for a while, the breeze cool and the land somewhat barren from the presence of the Hellhound. None of them celebrated. What was there to celebrate? The fact that they stopped the Hellhound, not defeated, but stopped, or that it took 6 of them to do so. Then a sudden realization crawled on their skin. Monrog was better than them. Ragnar looked at his arm and noticed the bleeding stopped. The cells were repairing themselves and the tissues were regenerating, slowly but surely. Still, his bones would take longer to heal. No one could hide pain like that. For a warrior, he slipped up and felt disgraced. While the werewolf within could heal the physical wounds, unfortunately, the sting on his ego wouldn't be so easy to overcome. The group stood near the mountaintop conversing with each other. Fesliyan had finally gotten a chance to speak to Victor after so long, and he was amazed by how much he has changed since they last spoke. Victor was also impressed by the vampire's menacing and terrifying form, while smiling at each other, remembering the fight they had in the woods. The elf and dwarf exchanged pleasantries with the vampire and the witch. Fesliyan and Myra were starstruck, seeing how absolutely breathtakingly gorgeous the elf was, almost like looking at an angel without wings. Except if the angel had pinpoint precision and unnatural eyesight. They were more impressed by the power and agility the dwarf showed, since his build was stocky, bulky, and short. Berthold noticed Ragnar distracted by his thoughts, the way one would look trying to solve a mystery in their head. Victor and Myra then shared the story of how the Hellhounds went after them in Redwater. The battle then moved into the woods, the people entered the Harrow through Myra's portal, Victor was momentarily knocked out by Mondrax, and before the witch could continue, Ragnar had interrupted.
When the Grey Werewolf was momentarily knocked out, how did you fend off 2 Hellhounds by yourself, witch? That is some remarkable power. Not a single scratch on your body.
The group looked at Ragnar, but Myra kept her head down. The witch nervously and anxiously rubbed her fingers together when she said,
"Oh, that was luck, I guess. Besides, Victor gained consciousness quite quickly. My main priority was the townfolk of Redwater and trying to help the werewolf."
Fesliyan stepped back and frowned. The vampire skill of knowing when someone lied screamed at him. Myra was indeed lying. Ragnar hurt all over his body, but mustered all the strength that he could with his one arm and grabbed the witch by her neck. The werewolf dangled Myra over the mountain ledge as she squirmed in his grasp.
One more lie, witch, and my fingers just might slip.
Victor and Fesliyan, confused and angered, dashed forward, but they were stopped, dead in their tracks. Berthold held his axe in front of Victor and said, This is a silver axe, laddie. The elves can give you life, but the dwarves can take it away." Eleanor had already drawn 3 wooden razor-sharp arrows, pointing at the vampire's chest. The elf's flirtatious wink might have given the wrong impression, but upon further inspection, Fesliyan saw it in her eyes. No hesitation to kill. The dwarf and elf had no idea why Ragnar grabbed the witch, nor did they need to. They knew the white wolf would have a very good explanation for doing so, hence they chose to have his back. That is undying loyalty. Ragnar Leifson said,
"Speak quickly, witch. My arm is giving way."
The white wolf never held Myra in a position to hurt her. His hand was placed rather than choking. The more she moved, the more pain the witch brought upon herself. There was no doubt that witches in this world were powerful, sometimes way too powerful for their own good. Be it spells, portals, healing, persuasion, they were talented, knowledgeable, and fascinating. However, no witch alive can enclose a hellhound and toss him around like a toy. This reminded Ragnar of the time when he was trapped in the same barrier, being tossed around by the crone with ease. This was more than Myra being possibly stronger than Ragnar or Monrog, since the white wolf knew that normal magic doesn't work on beings that went to hell and back. Monrax, Monrix, Monrog, and Ragnar himself will not have any trouble facing normal witches with ordinary magic, which is the reason Monrog sneezed when Myra first attacked him. The Witch of Redwater had dark magic flowing through her veins, and dark magic only comes from. Victor's eyes glowed yellow as he grunted, and Fesliyan's changed blood red with his fangs showing. The tension and frustration grew. The Witch of Redwater, realizing there was no way this ends well if she keeps silent. Then she had finally revealed the secret. Myra's voice sounded defeated, disgraced, saddened, and embarrassed.
The hellhounds weren't allowed to attack me, neither are any demons. My grandmother. My grandmother is one of the crones. It's a generational curse. I was supposed to follow in their footsteps, but I swear, I'm not like them. Please believe me.
Fesliyan's eyes widened with shock. The elf lowered her bow and the dwarf his axe. Victor the werewolf was confused, having not known about the crones yet. The vampire said, "How is that possible? You told me your grandmother died." Ragnar gently placed Myra back onto the ledge. This time there was no insect remark, no vampire insult. This time Ragnar referred to the vampire respectfully, then explained the crones aren't living people. The white wolf told Myra how the demons downstairs would want him to kill her after the reveal, something that he wouldn't do. If Myra was a crone, then Ragnar would have taken off her head by now, but she was merely a granddaughter. The werewolf knew how a stigma can ruin one's reputation. Furthermore, if the witch did work for the crones, then Victor would have already been dead. Now was the time to strengthen the alliance, not break it. Ragnar just wanted the truth, but not everyone felt the same. Fesliyan the vampire didn't show the same compassion towards Myra. His stare at the witch was filled with betrayal, disappointment, and rage. While Captain Langley's death was still being investigated, he knew it had to be one of the crones. They were also responsible for the werewolf massacre in Houndsville, the deaths of Holt and Lincoln, and not forgetting wanting his heart for a ritual. Just as Myra raised her hand to justify herself, a flare shot in the distance. Thick red smoke traveled through the sky, and Eleanor jumped on the roof of Ragnar's wooden cabin. The elf landed like a feather, so silent the group never heard her. She squinted her eyes and noticed the flare came from Redwater, miles and miles away. The elf said,
"Strange. The flare is coming from the Redwater police station."
Fesliyan the vampire cop, with urgency in his expression, changed into a wisp of dark smoke and traveled swiftly without saying goodbye. Fesliyan Hunt the locksmith sat at his workbench trying to develop new mechanisms. While his long, elegant dark hair and neatly trimmed beard might give off the impression of a glamour boy, his hands showed the opposite. Rugged, veiny, with cuts and bruises that were too many to count. Hard-working hands that made an honest living in a village, struggling and poor. While he never earned much, his positive attitude towards life was certainly contagious. With his white long-sleeve baggy cotton shirt rolled up to his forearms and a dirty leather apron strapped onto him, he watched the wooden door of his workshop slowly opening. Old man Fenwick walked in with a look of worry on his face. "Oh, forgive me, Fesliyan the locksmith," he said. "How wrong and foolish was I to visit the other locksmiths instead of you. They scammed me, I say. They scammed an old man in need. The locking mechanism and the key they have bestowed upon me was merely a fake. My doors open and close themselves with a mere gush of wind. How can I sleep at night knowing my wife and daughter have no security? Will you graciously forgive and help me, Fesliyan?" The locksmith smiled warmly at Mr. Fenwick, making jokes to turn the frown into a chuckle. Old man Fenwick truly was troubled, especially with the marriage of his daughter Anne-Marie just around the corner. At dusk, despite the workshop being closed to customers, Fesliyan Hunt took 15 minutes to make the best locking mechanism in all the land. Then he carved a key with crude metal and gifted the old man. Fesliyan saw Mr. Fenwick counting pennies and doing the math in his head. His old, trembling, wrinkled hand held on tight to his last penny with the look of defeat on his face, then gently offered it to the locksmith. However, Fesliyan Hunt refused to take the coin. He said, "Oh no, Mr. Fenwick, I shan't take any coin from you. Keep it for Anne-Marie's dowry. Just make sure that the marriage goes well and have the biggest mug of wine for me. You work too hard, Mr. Fenwick, you deserve it. Oh, and here's a bag of bread from me, my gift to the family." This was true. Fesliyan Hunt was an awful businessman but a kind-hearted soul. There was no other. Mr. Fenwick sobbed in his hands, trying to hide the embarrassment. He wiped his nose and tears and thanked the locksmith 5 times before walking out. Times were tough indeed. Mr. Hunt put a blanket down on the wooden floor of his workstation, then tossed a big fluffy pillow next to it. The locksmith slept on his makeshift bed, thankful for everything that he had. Despite him struggling, he had bread on his table and a roof over his head, something that very few could say in the village. The quietness of the night and the cool breeze helped people sleep easier than usual. However, that was soon about to change. The locksmith jumped up from his sleeping position, startled as ever. Outside his home, the village folk frantically ran and screamed for their lives, taking shelter while pointing at the sky. "He's here," they exclaimed repeatedly, pointing at the flying creature circling the village. Fesliyan Hunt stormed out of his home and looked up at the night sky. Then he saw it. A terrifying vampire monster with large wings and glowing red eyes. Its teeth were not long but multiplied and razor sharp. The interior of the wings resembled that of a bat, but it was stained with a dark crimson color. The body was peculiar, muscular and furry, with 2 horns pushing out on either side of its head. The monster was so large that every time it flapped its wings, a gush of wind blew and knocked people over. But when the creature landed, its appearance changed drastically. A tall man with long gray hair matching his coat was now standing in the village. The red eyes remained the same, so did the sharp fingernails and teeth, but his mannerisms were calm and collected. There was something about the way he walked, strides slow and steady, filled with arrogance, malice and terror. This would be Vlad Tepes, aka Dracula. Fesliyan trembled in his boots. The village folk continued running in fear, stumbling and knocking over obstacles in their path. This was only a brief moment. The locksmith locked eyes with the vampire in front, but it felt like an eternity. As scared as Fesliyan was, he turned back and ran, not to retreat but to get as many people out of the village. Children, women and the elderly man came first, then the rest. Mr. Fenwick grabbed his chest, getting chest pains with the chaos around him. When he and his wife were taken to safety, he begged Fesliyan to try and find Anne-Marie. The locksmith continued rescuing people at a much slower pace since fatigue was now settling in. But with each person he saved, he heard 5 more being slaughtered. Dracula moved at the speed of light, but it never looked like he ran or walked, rather dashed forward in the blink of an eye. This was a village massacre. Fesliyan Hunt felt the hopelessness slowly consuming his body. When he ran back to the village to get more people out, he saw Anne-Marie. "Marie!" he exclaimed in horror. A young woman with long dark brown hair, almost the same age as Fesliyan, was now in the grasp of Dracula. He held her tightly against his body as she struggled, and then pushed her head to the side and sunk his fangs into her neck. Fesliyan yelled at the higher vampire running towards him, his eyes filled with tears, unable to hide the fear which made his body tremble. But Fesliyan was too late. Anne-Marie's eyes closed slowly. Then Dracula tossed her to the ground. In his calm, collected, monotone, whispering voice, he said, "You there, young man. I will give you two choices. You can continue saving people as I destroy this village, or you can face me one-on-one. Buy these folks some time to escape, and who knows, maybe you will defeat me. Maybe you will die. Or maybe I will turn you." Now, as Fesliyan the vampire cop made haste from the village of the Harrow, he reached the Redwater police station. He heard gunfire from the precinct and saw the red smoke from the flares surrounding the entire building. Inspectors yelling out commands, shouting out positions, and others screaming in horror. But next to the building stood Dracula. No matter how dark the night was, his pale skin and red eyes could easily be spotted. His long grey coat matched his long dark grey hair blowing in the wind, while he nibbled on his razor-sharp fingernails. This menacing, troublesome, extremely powerful vampire oozed confidence. The evil smirk on his pale face spoke more words than he ever could. Fesliyan Hunt's eyes were smoldering red as he clenched his jaw and fist, ready to charge at Dracula. The higher vampire, however, held out a finger in front. "Easy there, Inspector. I'm going to give you two choices. You could either face me and maybe defeat me, since you are now a vampire. And by doing so, you could rid this world of me and all the horrors that I will most certainly commit. Or you could enter your beloved Redwater police station and save your precious loyal servants of the law from the monster that I have set loose on them. What will it be? You can take your chances with your creator, or save those people, revealing your secret and showing them all you are a vampire. Decide quickly, boy. The monster in there is really hungry." Fesliyan's entire body shook with rage as he ground his teeth. The same dilemma Dracula gave him almost a century ago. The vampire reluctantly looked away from Dracula and ran towards the entrance of the police station. And just before Dracula could vanish into a wisp of smoke, he laughed in an evil, conceited manner, then said, "So the games begin." The vampire cop entered the police station and saw bullets flying across the room and smoke grenades detonating. The inspectors weren't really aiming. They took cover and shot blindly. But when Fesliyan ran forward, the chaos ceased. The monster in the precinct stopped the onslaught. A woman with an ugly, petrifying face was levitating in the air just before she calmly landed. She stood on one of the wooden tables, swaying and dancing to music that wasn't playing. Her long, sharp teeth slowly changed back into its normal state. The woman then held a hand to her face and licked the back of her palm, the same way that a cat would lick its paw, as she took in all the blood blotches. Her long dark brown hair swayed with her as her hips moved side to side seductively. The woman then turned in a swirl motion and finally faced the entrance. "Fesliyan," she said in a cheeky tone, laughing like a maniac, "it's been too long." As the vampire cop looked around the room and saw the bodies of a few inspectors lying on the floor, the wounded quietly crawling away to the medical bay, and the remainder reloading their weapons for a second attack, he realized Dracula wasn't lying about a monster being in the precinct. But Fesliyan never thought this monster hopping on the table laughing sadistically would be Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie looked around the chaos that she created. "Oopsie doopsie," she said, "looks like I've made a mess." Fesliyan Hunt stood in bewilderment. How on earth was any of this possible, he thought. The woman then bolted across the room, jumped out the window, and flew away. The Redwater police force that had their weapons aiming at her slowly changed their direction from the window towards Fesliyan. One by one, they began shouting at him. How did this monster know who you were? And why didn't she attack you? The vampire cop backed up as he felt the anxiety building up in his chest. What was he supposed to say? That he knew Anne-Marie 100 years ago before any of them were even born? Was he supposed to tell them right then and there that he's been lying to them this entire time? Captain Mills walked in front of Fesliyan as his eyes widened. She faced her back towards him, willing to take the line of fire head on, just to save him. Mills painfully held her neck where Anne-Marie had made a gash, and said,
Is this what has become of the RPF? The moment Captain Langley dies and you all begin turning on each other? Fesliyan Hunt has been working this serial killer case since 2 days ago. She's sending him and all of us a message to leave her alone. Can you all not see that? Oh, and a monster? Don't you know she specializes in hallucinogens? We only saw what she wanted us to see. That is her trick. Frightens her victims and then snatch them away. We've dealt with bizarre serial killers before.
The inspectors put their weapons down only to find guilt covering their faces. We're sorry, Fesliyan, they said. It was the heat of the moment. Adrenaline pumping. So far you haven't led us astray. We were wrong for pointing our weapons at you. Of course, they never knew Captain Mills was lying to them. Fesliyan Hunt never knew Anne-Marie was alive until 5 minutes ago. While everyone in the precinct tended to their wounds and carried the unconscious towards the ambulance, Captain Mills gave a side eye to the vampire cop, calling him into her office immediately.
Where on God's green earth were you, Fesliyan? I sent you on the Crimson Lichen case 2 days ago, and you went MIA.
Forgive me, Captain, I was caught up in something. Still am, actually, but
nothing. I cannot keep covering for you, Inspector. Now, I can't lie anymore. You have to take on this case whether you like it or not. And whatever people ask you, do not answer. My orders. I had to lie about the hallucinogen part. Our inspectors are not used to seeing vampire creatures. But more importantly, how did she know your name?
Many people know of me, Captain. But what I want to know is, why did you refer to her as the woman in black? When was she reported to be a serial killer?
About 70 years ago.
What?
Yeah, the case of the woman in black turned cold a long time ago. Have a seat, Fesliyan. I'll go through it with you.
The vampire cop sat at Captain Mills' desk, reading pages from multiple books at a time, while Mills ran down the details. The Redwater police station had no digital database, which meant that everything was recorded in books and booklets of parchment paper tied with string.
The first report was 70 years ago. A group of friends were roaming around in an abandoned building when they heard screams echoing through, screams of torture. Foolishly, they chose to investigate themselves. Out of the 5 friends, only one survived. He said it was a mini dungeon in an abandoned building with people tied up with ropes and chains being drained of their blood. The blood was filling up into vials kept on a wooden table. But here's the scary part. The witness said the victims in the dungeon weren't all human. Some were men covered in thick fur, presumed to be werewolves, while others were vampires. However, there were more humans than the previously mentioned. He described the serial killer as the woman in black. She had long, dark brown hair, glowing red eyes, sharp teeth, claws, and wings pushing out from her back. Her black dress stained with blood from the many victims she tortured and killed, 67 to be exact.
How did the guy survive?
No idea. The report doesn't say.
Where was the abandoned building located?
It was near Cascada before the large city was revamped into a gold mine. But the inspector's report that handled the case mentioned the mini dungeon was empty when they got there. No vampires, no werewolves, and none of the reported missing folk hanging from chains. The building was destroyed over time, and the case went cold. None of the missing people were found.
Okay, since then, how many other reports have there been?
Quite a few, actually, but no one knows if it was really her or a copycat.
So did all the reports come from Cascada?
Nope, here in Redwater, actually. Some said they saw a woman wearing a black dress dragging victims into the woods. When people followed, neither she nor the victims were seen. It's like they vanished into thin air. Others saw the woman in black levitating in the air, just like what we saw 10 minutes ago. I thought it was some ghost story or spooky tale, but when she showed up in our precinct, that was enough confirmation for me.
This is just not possible. None of this is possible.
Wait, why? What do you mean?
The woman that you speak of, the one that you all know as the woman in black, I know as Anne-Marie. She was the daughter of an elderly man named Mr. Fenwick. They lived in the same village that I did.
So you do know her, but why do you keep referring to her in the past tense?
Well, that's because Anne-Marie died almost 100 years ago. You see, Captain, that night in the village when some of us were bitten to be killed and others to be turned by Dracula, Anne-Marie was one of the victims belonging to the former. I don't know how long I passed out for that night, but when I did wake up, I saw my village being destroyed. People that I once knew were now ruthless vampires, feeding on the remaining village folk. Anne-Marie was still lying on the ground, and next to her was Mr. Fenwick and his wife. I fought my way out of the village, carrying all three of them with me. They were good people, Captain. Mr. Fenwick put bread on my table when I was a novice locksmith. I had to give them a proper burial. Anne-Marie was bitten before me. If she was turned that night, she would have waken up before I did. Captain Mills was lost for words. This was the first time she saw sadness on Fesliyan's face. With how the vampire cop carries out himself, no one would ever think that he went through something that tragic. She said,
But if Anne-Marie died all those years ago and you buried her, how did she become a vampire monster?
Yep, that's what I would like to know. It's not unheard of for people to be turned into vampires after they have died, but no one knew where I buried Anne-Marie. Unless she crawled out of her grave during me dealing with a ghost, or an imposter just to mess with my mind. Either way, Captain, I must take your leave. My investigation begins immediately.
But Fesliyan, how are you going to go? The sun will be up in a few hours.
I have no choice, Captain. Unfortunately, I do not have the luxury of time on my hands. I'm going to have to find a way to walk in the sun and solve this case before the upcoming nightfall. However, you needn't worry. You have all these inspectors to tend to in Captain Langley's investigation. You have my undying thanks, Captain Mills, and forgive me for my absence. I give you my word that I will never let you down again. As Fesliyan Hunt got out of his chair, taking the books and the parchment paper of the reports, Captain Mills reminded him where the recent sightings of the woman in black were, just on the outskirts of Redwater. The vampire cop thanked Captain Mills and then walked out, hiding the troublesome thought swimming in his mind. The outskirts of Redwater near the woods was exactly where Fesliyan buried her. Fesliyan Hunt ran home as quickly as possible before sunrise. He could have changed into a monster yet again, but recently using that power against Ragnar and then on the Hellhound sure did take its toll. He made his way down to his wooden basement filled with an arsenal of weapons and books dating back right from the previous month all the way to the time before he was even born. Books that contained vital information about monsters that made his job much easier. Fesliyan placed the books he had taken from Captain Mills onto a wooden table. With candles beside him, he spent the early hours of the morning reading the reports of the woman in black and saw the sketches of the missing people in the past 70 years. But he couldn't believe what he was reading. Some of the missing folk were the same people that he rescued from the village that night. 2 hours and 16 minutes later, the sun rose. As Fesliyan told Captain Mills, time was of the essence. The Jungle of Belru was one of the stories that he read from his library in the basement. Since the vampire cop was the fastest among all the heroes thus far, he needed to be present for the jungle mission. He then opened a cupboard in the basement and pulled out an old, dusty, hooded brown cloak. This piece of clothing was a much bigger size than Fesliyan normally wore, but for good reason. This old brown cloak blocked out every bit of sunlight. Still very risky, but he had no other choice. Similar to how we would grab a coffee or tea to go, Fesliyan Hunt had grabbed a cup of blood, then made haste to the woods of Redwater. First things first, he needed to investigate Anne-Marie's gravesite. Folk passing by never saw the pale vampire disguised in his cloak. They just saw him as a beggar roaming around aimlessly. This would be the first time since that night that he would see the graves of the Fenwicks, not because he had forgotten about them, because it was just too painful returning. Anne-Marie's grave was indeed dug out. The soil was dry with roots and weeds that were sticking out. Captain Mills was right. She had been out for a really long time. First tick off the checklist. This was no ghost that they were dealing with. This was certainly Anne-Marie. As Fesliyan walked into the woods of Redwater, the largest woodland area in all the land, he remembered the reports. Humans, vampires, and werewolves were being held captive, being drained of their blood and then kept in vials by the woman in black. He also remembered the description of the werewolves as hairy, furry men, which indicated they were natural-born werewolves. Fesliyan felt a sense of unease looming in his mind. Mixing the blood of normal humans with werewolves and vampires was a recipe for disaster. Literally. The trees in the woods of Redwater had their own unique power. If one would listen closely, the trees would play back the sound of those who were tortured in the woods, like an invisible tape recorder. Fesliyan Hunt closed his eyes and listened attentively. Fesliyan played back the reports in his head about the woman in black walking into the woods late at night, then mysteriously vanishing. However, he knew that she couldn't change into a wisp of smoke, not like himself and Dracula. If Anne-Marie could, she would have done so in the precinct. Fesliyan heard the screams of those being dragged in the woods all those years ago. The trees played back sounds of footsteps on wood, then a latch opening and closing. Then he opened his eyes and looked at the ground, realizing Anne-Marie never vanished into thin air, rather moved underground. It took the vampire cop almost 3 hours moving as quickly as he possibly could, but eventually he found it. There were leaves blended in quite well, hiding the wooden latch door in the woods. Anne-Marie covered her tracks to the extent of painting the door with the same color and texture of the soil on the ground. Fesliyan held out his finger and his nail grew 5 inches, sharp and pointy. He used it as a lockpick to open the latch on the wooden door, lifted it open while looking around, then carefully made his way underground. When the vampire cop walked down the stairs, he felt like the path was leading him into the abyss. The staircase just continued and continued in absolute darkness. Halfway down, he turned back, contemplating whether this was a huge mistake. However, as he continued, he saw a dim light at the bottom from lanterns. Finally, some progress. But when Fesliyan reached the bottom of the staircase entering the dark and cold dungeon, he was attacked. What on earth was this creature? Was this a werewolf? The furry body and pointy snout had indicated as such, but why did this creature have yellow human eyes? Why were the 2 fangs on the upper row of teeth so distinctive? Why were its ears so pointy and peculiar? This malevolent beast merely nudged Fesliyan and pushed him back almost a meter. The vampire cop fell to the ground, but swiftly pulled out his pistol concealed in his old brown cloak. If this monster really was a werewolf, silver bullets would either slow it down or end it entirely. Hence, Fesliyan fired a few shots. What the? Fesliyan was stunned. Werewolves were fast, but not that fast. It moved the way a vampire would. The monster crawled towards the vampire, hissing and grunting, taking swipes as Fesliyan backed up each time. Alas, the monster's razor claws caught into the vampire's cloak and ripped it to shreds. While Fesliyan could now move freely, the look of panic on his face could not be contained. Not even the Crimson Lycan was this quick. Not even Ragnar was this quick. A fearsome battle took place with this unknown creature and the vampire cop. Fesliyan Hunt punched, kicked, elbowed and kneed at every possible weak point that he could think of, but it did nothing. As the fight went on, there was a feeling of defeat looming in the air for him. He was indeed still faster than this beast, but how could he defeat something that never felt pain? Something that never felt pain. Fesliyan's eyes widened. If this creature couldn't feel pain, that meant the thalamus and the cortex in the monster's brain was either damaged or manipulated. The vampire cop moved around the beast as smooth as water, maneuvering between rocks. He swung his hand out as if this move was a switch of some sort. His fingernails grew 5 inches, becoming razor-edged knives, and then used it in 3 distinctive spots. First spot was in the side of the monster, just above the hip. Second was inside the armpit. And third was the most important, directly into the brain. The monster's glowing yellow eyes dimmed and turned off like a worn-out light bulb. However, the creature's brain burst like a pumpkin falling to the ground and soaked the vampire cop's long black coat with crimson blood. Just when Fesliyan thought he could take a moment to reset, calm his nerves, 5 more of these creatures bolted out from one of the dungeon rooms, viciously lunging at the vampire cop. While they had similarities to the first beast in terms of movement and their human eyes, they did look different. Some were smaller, leaner, leaning towards the vampire side, whereas the rest were larger, muscular, leaning towards the werewolf side. Hybrids. The vampire cop never wasted any more ammunition. He never used the wooden stake in his long black coat to pierce their heart, since neither options worked. Instead, he slew them down just like the first monster, swiftly but with incredible power and speed. Once they were down, he inspected the dungeon using his lightning-quick speed and found no other hybrid creatures, just vials and vials of blood and operating tables. However, when he made his way back, the relief on Fesliyan's face turned into absolute horror. The hybrids on the ground gradually decreased in size, losing their fur and pointy ears, losing their sharp teeth, pale skin and muscular, terrifying bodies, and turned into normal humans. But these were not just any ordinary humans. These were the missing people from the reports more than 70 years ago. What cruel game of misfortune had been cast upon Fesliyan Hunt? Some of the very folk he rescued from the village that night were now lying at his feet, slain by his hand. Fesliyan fell to his knees and felt sick to his stomach. He pulled and messed up his neatly slicked back hair in despair. Young men and women were lying at his feet. A few elderly folk that he remembered from back then were now deceased because of him. Despite them being no more the people that he once knew, despite them being vicious, hybrid monsters that were going to rip him to shreds, Fesliyan Hunt could only see them as the victims that he once saved. How was this even possible? What on earth was going on here? The vampire cop repeatedly checked on them, waking them up, gently tapping their faces as his voice was shaky, filled with worry and panic. "What have I done?" he repeatedly said. He knew they wouldn't wake up, yet his heart tried nevertheless. Absolutely distraught and numb from everything that just happened, his hands trembled uncontrollably, removing a phone the size of a brick from his coat. It took him a while to dial the correct number, but then Captain Mills picked up. His message was short, cold, and to the point. He told Captain Mills not to pursue this case any further. He told her how he found the dungeon of Anne-Marie and how she's been experimenting on the missing people, turning them into werewolf vampire hybrids. For the safety of the entire police force, he urged her not to send any inspectors into the woods of Redwater. Captain Mills repeatedly asked him if he was okay, but he ignored the question. The signal was poor, therefore Fesliyan cut the call. But now he felt the entire dungeon shaking. Was this an earthquake, a tremor perhaps? A disaster causing the dungeon to cave in? As Fesliyan ran up the flight of stairs back into the woods, he felt the entire ground tremble as the leaves on the trees fell to the ground with each bang. But this wasn't a tremor or an earthquake. The rhythmic vibration in succession increased in tempo and amplitude. When he climbed out, he never realized how long he spent in the dungeon, since it was already dark. He heard werewolves howling in the distance. He heard the sound of magical explosions and growls. Fesliyan Hunt slammed the dungeon door in anger and left it the way he found it. No, this was no tremor. This was the sound of the drums and the marching of the monster barbarians in the distance. With a heavy heart, a troubled mind, and a soul filled with turmoil, the vampire cop ran as fast as he possibly could, making his way to the jungle of Belru. The werewolves were going to re-enter the jungle to fetch Myra, but a wisp of dark smoke flew past them within seconds and then entered the jungle. A gush of wind whistled through the foliage. This dark black smoke smothered the barbarians, circling them, and when it moved on, the cannibal beast fell to the ground with their throats slit open. The barbarians were being cut down, and while Fesliyan hunt was late, he was now in the jungle of Belru. Myra's projectile orbs weren't as big and powerful anymore. Nala the snake had vanished into thin air from the lack of energy the witch had from keeping her summoned. Within seconds, the vampire cop used his 6-inch sharp fingernails and cut down the barbarians surrounding her in a swirl motion, then grabbed Myra and took her out of the jungle. Fesliyan left her in the arms of the werewolves waiting outside, then bolted back in. The vampire needed to find Victor ASAP, hoping the stone tablet was in his hands. However, the barbarians stopped like they were frozen. Those cannibalistic monsters felt fear after a very long time. But why weren't they moving? What had terrified them? The barbarian horde was standing in a circle, and in front of them lie the severed heads of the 5 giants. Those heads landed at that spot when Victor kicked them like footballs. The vampire then saw Victor walking from behind the foliage. The werewolf, however, looked terrifying. His muscles much larger, filled with lactic acid. His eyes were no more yellow but rather amber. His eerie smile sent a chill down Fesliyan's spine, a smile so creepy that it stretched his jaw, showing how sharp his teeth really were. Victor was holding the stone tablet in his hand. When he looked at Fesliyan, that evil smile slowly diminished. This entire exchange happened within a few seconds, while the barbarians were grunting and speaking their own language from witnessing the severed heads of their giant leaders. The werewolf and the vampire never said a word, they just looked at each other. Victor then gave the stone tablet to Fesliyan. The vampire then gently grabbed it while looking into Victor's eyes, witnessing it changing rapidly from amber to red in succession. Amber to red, amber to red, amber to red. The werewolf then calmly nodded his head while looking at Fesliyan, and the vampire returned the gesture. No spoken word, just communication with the eyes, and somehow Fesliyan knew exactly what Victor was going to do. The vampire cop with the stone tablet in his hand ran at the speed of light, slicing and dicing however many barbarians in his path, making his way out the jungle. Fesliyan the vampire made it out the jungle. The stone tablet tucked inside his long black coat, which now looked like crimson with so much of blood covering him. His hair messy, his body tired, but his eyes had nothing behind them. Myra ran to embrace him, but he stopped her by holding the stone tablet in front of him. "Keep it safe and leave," he said. Myra was confused, and so were the allies. Fesliyan looked up at the sky with only a few minutes remaining for sunrise. The vampire then thanked everyone that stood in front of him, then suggested to one of the witches, either Sasha or Samantha, to open a portal for them to return at home at once. As confused as they all were while looking behind the vampire to see if Victor made it out, they had no choice but to leave. Myra then thanked the allies one last time, a heartfelt and graceful thank you for risking their lives on this mission, something that will never be forgotten. Once the portal closed and the allies returned to their homes, the witch then turned to Fesliyan.
What happened to you, Fesliyan? Whose blood is that?
She said, looking at all the blood soaked into his clothes. The vampire said, "It's a long story, one that I will not share, one that I will not be judged for, one that I would like to forget." "You can leave," he said, his voice slow and calm. "What happens to the stone tablet in Victor's absence is your responsibility. Farewell." The vampire never looked at Myra this entire time, perhaps still angry with her for hiding the secret of her dark magic, or perhaps whatever Fesliyan has been through in the past day or two had changed him. The vampire then began walking away. Myra said,
Fesliyan, please, if you don't want to tell me what happened, that's fine. If you don't want to open up to me again, that's fine, I can take it. But please, we need to get Victor. He's stuck in that jungle with those ruthless barbarians.
The vampire continued walking away with his blood-covered back facing the witch. He remembered the look Victor gave him a few minutes ago inside the jungle. That deep, dark, and menacing look in his eyes that spoke volumes. Fesliyan said he'll be fine. Besides, you did not see what I did. Fesliyan Hunt had this cheeky smirk plastered on his face. As the sun rose, the vampire walked into the shadows and said, You got it backwards, Myra. Victor isn't stuck in the jungle with the barbarians. They are trapped in the jungle with him. Just after midnight, a peculiar, mysterious, terrifying animal ran like the wind on all fours. Its skin and fur dark like the night, ears pointy, eyes glowing yellow, claws so sharp and distinctive with its back arched. But as the animal ran, it slowly began changing. From animal to creature, the yellow eyes remained the same but grew in size, just like the sharp teeth and limbs. This malevolent beast began crawling like a spider, making its way to an isolated farmhouse. Now seemingly larger than ever, the two horns pushed out on either side of its head. From a furry body to reptilian scaly skin, the agility and the speed of this unknown monster was impressive as it pounced on the roof, peeking through windows looking for an opening. With a shriek loud and eerie, whistling in the wind on a dark, gloomy Friday night, the monster then looked around one more time, hoping its spine-chilling shriek had chased away any witnesses. The monster then entered the farmhouse through one of the windows by shrinking its body. Shortly after, the screams of the victims inside had echoed through the quiet, lonely night. It's been 12 hours since Fesliyan Hunt made his way out of the jungle of Belru. His sleep was disrupted with the troublesome thoughts and nightmares screaming in his mind. Which was more terrifying, seeing how frightening the hybrids were in the dungeon of Red Water, or seeing them change back into the folk that he once knew? Folk that should have died of natural causes more than 50 years ago. 6 p.m. when the sun set, he walked downstairs to his basement and placed an empty journal onto a wooden table. Beside the journal were a quill and a small jar of black ink. From all the books in his library, from all the books being sold across the land, Fesliyan Hunt would be the first person to document an encounter with a werewolf-vampire hybrid, something that never existed before. Then he wrote down key points. Their appearances, the way they moved, able to dodge bullets with ease, their scent, their strength, much stronger than normal werewolves and vampires but just a tad bit weaker than Victor and Ragnar. Not forgetting the hybrids' minds were driven by some sort of experimental possession. Then he documented their weaknesses, and while research still needed to be done on these hybrid creatures, destroying their brain was the only method that worked at the time. With 6 pages filled in with immaculate handwriting, the vampire then closed the journal and leaned back in his chair. As Fesliyan sipped on his mug of blood, he thought about Dracula and Anne-Marie. If Dracula wanted him dead, he was sure the higher vampire would have been more than capable of doing so outside the precinct, but he didn't. Most folk now know him as Gilroy, but a few, like Fesliyan, knew Dracula was asleep in his castle for more than 50 years. This castle was protected by magical shields and spells by the Wizards of Three, making sure no supernatural being could ever enter. Then there was Anne-Marie. Why and how did she become a vampire monster? Why didn't she continue the onslaught in the police station? What was the point of bolting out the window and flying away? This seemed like some sick game of cat and mouse that Dracula played with the vampire cop. But if there was one thing that Fesliyan did know, was that Dracula clearly needed him alive. The horrifying question, however, was why? Fesliyan also figured out they wanted him to chase them, let vengeance drive his soul in extracting revenge from the vampire that once turned him and ruined his life. However, that also told him that they wanted to keep him busy from finding any more of Anne-Marie's hybrids. For now, Fesliyan walked to the bedroom, opened his wardrobe and donned a new set of work clothes. His trusty long black coat, shirt, vest and black pants with his boots laced up prim and proper, not forgetting his old inspector's hat that was hooked to the side of his belt. With all the chaos in the past few days, he remembered the promise that he made to Captain Mills. "I give you my word that I will never let you down again." Thus, the vampire cop walked out of his wooden cabin and took a breath of fresh air in the cold night while waiting for the 8 p.m. train. Certainly, he would work tirelessly to find more dungeons and hybrids along the way, but for now, his destination was to the Redwater police station. After all, Fesliyan's shift will start soon and he would do what he does best: solve cases, rescue innocent folk, and make sure that evildoers, human or creature, met justice. This was his job: serve and protect the folk that couldn't do so for themselves. The vampire cop entered the Redwater police station with his charming smile that slowly turned into a frown. The old telephones rang non-stop, with inspectors frantically writing down reports. One of the inspectors, Felicia S. Gunstrom, a beautiful black woman that joined the force when Fesliyan did, had now picked her head up in horror. The vampire cop dashed forward to her desk, helping her write down the witness reports. Why were the phones going crazy? Next to her was Julian, the one that showed Fesliyan the ropes when he joined. A 45-year-old man with a balding head and shoulders the size of bowling balls. He's been in the Redwater police force for 27 years and has turned down the captain position 6 times and counting. Speaking of a captain, Lara Mills answered call after call in her office. Panic and urgency plastered on all of their faces and confusion on Fesliyan's. Why were there so many reports being filed at once? Alongside every inspector at their desk was a sketch artist. Sometimes, for situations like these, when witnesses weren't able to make it to the station, they gave a telephonic report while the artist would turn their descriptions of the suspect into an image for the Redwater police force. 15 reports were made in the span of 5 minutes. The once panicky, frantic police station turned into deafening silence. Felicia said this has to be a joke, people playing the fool with us. Julian said no way this all happened at the same time. Whispers had filled the police station talking about the reports. From werewolves to woodland beasts, the night could not get any spookier. But could the Redwater police station really believe these telephonic reports? They looked at Captain Mills walking out of her office, her eyes fixed on the vampire cop with an expression of desperation and fear. Fesliyan, however, held all the reports in his hand, skimmed through it, then selected 5 of them. These 5 reports were the first among the 15 mentioning a new monster, each time respectively. He folded the parchment paper and placed it inside his long black coat while running out of the police station saying, "Fear not, Captain Mills, I will take this case, but I have to hurry." Felicia and Julian at the same time said, "He's quite the peculiar one, isn't he?" Lara Mills looked absolutely confused and chased after the vampire cop outside the police station.
Fesliyan, wait, I know you want to keep your mind busy. I know you're a vampire and a highly skilled one at that. But these are 5 suspects in one night. I didn't even finish reading all 15 reports. They spotted a werewolf, a vampire, a woodland beast, an unknown animal, and a creature with horns and yellow eyes. It's too dangerous.
The vampire cop stylishly donned his inspector's hat. His eyes glowed red and his expression filled with confidence. Then, just before making haste to the woods of Redwater, he said,
That's just it, Captain. We're not dealing with 5 suspects. Just one.
I am so confused it's not even funny. Fesliyan, are you sure?
Yes, Captain. We are dealing with a shapeshifter. Why was Fesliyan Hunt so confident in his deduction? Well, in order to go through the investigation, we need to understand the layout of Redwater, the 5 witness reports that he chose, and what gave its identity away. Redwater was the most occupied city in the land. It consisted of small towns and villages, wealthy, middle class, and poor, while being surrounded by the vastness of trees. Not only do the woodland areas provide camping spots for visitors, it welcomes all sorts of creatures, good and evil. Because the surrounding woods were so large, folk used the town and village names to pinpoint sections in the woods. For example, let's run down 5 out of the 15 reports. The first report was a werewolf sighting at Willow's Peak. Willow's Peak was the entrance of Redwater, home to a few towns but mostly villages ranging from poor to middle class. There was a townscouple that strolled in the woods on their way back home from the market. The grocery bags filled with vegetables had fallen to the ground after the woman screamed in horror. The man had grabbed her and ran behind a tree, taking shelter while trying to hide from what was in front of them. The couple claimed to have seen a werewolf, but this was a werewolf unlike the ones that existed in Redwater or from folklore. The creature seemed to be distorted, almost trying to conform to something. At first, it had dark black fur and large blue eyes, but that never lasted long. They said that it felt like a few seconds, but the werewolf creature began taking its form. Bright blue in color, long dirty ears, sharp claws and teeth, but the teeth was much shorter than a normal werewolf's. After a while, the strange werewolf creature stood upright like a human, looking at the spot the couple may be hiding at. Peculiar indeed. There was no roar, growl, or even a howl from this werewolf, despite the full moon being present. With every step the couple took, the werewolf followed them, slowly crawling on the ground the way a hunter would stalk its prey. Its ears pointing upward and its muscles now seemed larger than before. Then, in a bizarre turn of events, the werewolf dove in front of the couple and laid on its stomach. They said the creature looked hideous, almost like it had blue eyeshadow surrounding its deep yellow eyes. The creature then smiled at them while swaying its legs back and forth. The couple screamed in horror when they ran out of the woods as quickly as possible while turning back each time. When they ran out, they called the RPF to file the complaint. Then they noticed the werewolf-like creature looked distorted again, but ran away on all fours. Now, there were a few things wrong with the sighting, which is why Fesliyan flagged it. Firstly, there was no such thing as a blue werewolf. Secondly, there were no sounds of heavy breathing from the pain of the transformation, no sound of breaking bones, no roars, growls, howls, which was very unusual behavior for werewolves. Thirdly, unless the werewolf was Victor Humbridge soaked in blue dye, no human stands in front of a werewolf and lives to tell the tale. The fact that the werewolf creature smiled at them without devouring them whole was a huge deviation. The creature just wanted to be seen. Last but not least, as Fesliyan walked around the location of the reported sighting, he knelt down to the ground on one knee, then rubbed his hand over the branches and twigs on the woodland ground. He raised his fingers to his nose and sniffed. No scent or signs of fur. Natural-born, cursed, or even special-class werewolves like Ragnar shed fur like it's nobody's business. Yet, there was no sign of any blue or dark black fur as the reported sighting mentioned. Hence, Fesliyan Hunt declared this encounter a fake creature. The second report involved a vampire. The vampire cop rolled his eyes when he read this report. Location: Main Ridge. This area was mainly known for its trade of vegetables and furniture. There was a cutout path in the woods to allow wagons to pass through. A young carpenter was making his last delivery for the night. Main Ridge had folk born with talent, and this particular man made a few chairs and a table of the finest quality. However, as he claimed, a vampire ran across his path, tumbling not only him but his wagon as well. The carpenter described the vampire to have slicked back hair and red eyes while wearing full black clothing. That was the part in the report that made Fesliyan's eyes roll. He had sharp teeth and pale skin but kept scratching his body. The man said the vampire took a moment to catch his breath, panting heavily like an animal. The carpenter was scared, but he stood his ground and said, "Hey buddy, you broke my furniture, man. Stay right here until the police arrive, okay?" Absolutely petrified at what happened next, the vampire charged at the carpenter, or so it seemed. The man said the vampire ran like a normal human, but his face began changing with every stride that he took. Then, just when he reached the man, he continued running past him. The carpenter fell to the ground, holding his chest in sheer panic and confusion. He said the vampire continued running while his face changed even more, and then stopped when he saw the cat in the woods. The vampire creature then knelt down on his knees and gently stroked the cat's chin, while trying to conform to its appearance. The creature then retained the red eyes and sharp teeth, but developed pointy ears and a face just like the feline. The cat was then eaten. From the start, this encounter seemed suspicious. A vampire, weak or strong, would not be panting like an animal after running such a short distance. Furthermore, the report said that he ran like a man. Vampires, especially when hungry, would move so quickly that they would appear as a blur to a normal human. More so, the supposed vampire chose a feline to feed on over a human. Once again, the victim was spared. The carpenter said that he saw the vampire running towards central town, and that is where the third report was made, citing a different creature. The third report of the woodland beast pretty much sparked the same bizarre encounters as the previous two. However, this is what confirmed Fesliyan's suspicion. The monster they saw in the woods was on all fours, muscular like a bull, dark gray in color with horns and red eyes. Now, the only problem with this was, no such beast had ever existed. Few years ago, on All Hallows Eve, a group of teenagers made up a story about the woodland beast. They wrote and sketched out descriptions of how the creature looked, then stuck it on walls and signboards. With further investigation, folk had come to know that it were the teenagers that dressed up in a spooky costume just to spark fear on Halloween. Fesliyan was the one that worked this case and found no signs of supernatural activity back then. However, the fourth and fifth reports respectively was what separated the eerie encounters from the rest. An unknown animal and a large creature, both with yellow eyes. Redwater was pretty clued up with their knowledge of animals, therefore for this to be unknown was rather interesting. Fesliyan Hunt walked around the locations of both these creatures. While carrying out his usual questioning, he found out some vital information. This wasn't the first time that they saw this creature. Last night, just after midnight, folk had seen that unknown animal running towards a farmhouse. Those who were near the farmhouse saw the unknown animal change into a monstrosity. A large beast with the same yellow eyes, tall and powerful. This creature gave a loud shriek which chased away the bystanders, but they heard screams within the farmhouse shortly after. They also mentioned that it was fast and agile. The last line solidified the vampire cop's assumption. Shapeshifters in Redwater were supernatural creatures unlike any other, and certainly not conforming to the norm. Shapeshifters were struggling beings that were born with the ability passed down from generation to generation. Most of the time, they altered their appearances into animals just to avoid being caught in the witch hunts that took place in the land. Most shapeshifters never used the power for evil, and were in fact very pleasant to normal folk. They were poor, trying to fit into a land where job opportunities were scarce and the cost of living was all too high. It became easier to spot shapeshifters in their human form since all of them have a birthmark on their neck. These supernatural beings developed a mutualistic relationship with ordinary folk over time, helping out normal people being paid for it, thus surviving in the world. Of course, among any group of beings, there would always be a few that deviated from the path. This particular group of shapeshifters, while few, were taken in by the crones and used their power for evil. These shapeshifters, unlike the others, had actually taken human lives, which was the #1 rule that they weren't supposed to break. They had a few troublesome tricks up their sleeves which made them no pushovers. They have 3 forms which they have mastered. It could either be an animal or a creature, but in these forms, they would be at their strongest. The last 2 reports moving towards the farmhouse displayed just that. This was also the reason why the shapeshifter struggled to conform to other shapes and sizes, being slow as a vampire, turning blue as a werewolf, and changing into a beast that was proven to be a myth. This case, at first, seemed like a fun challenge for the vampire cop, since there were so many reports in one night and no victims got hurt. But since the locals told him about the screams inside the farmhouse, which was much further away from the other locations, now it raised concern. Fesliyan walked slowly and carefully towards the farmland region, the breeze cold and biting. He entered the woods and saw a newly made trail. This wasn't unusual since farmers used the off-road to transport produce all the time. With the farmhouse now in sight and the vampire cop almost out of the woods in this region, his movements became wary. Fesliyan constantly turned back, looking over his shoulder. Something was moving behind him in the darkness. The vampire cop could hear footsteps behind him. However, it didn't seem to come from something with 2 legs. The woods blocked out every bit of moonlight, and while Fesliyan's hunt was indeed much faster and stronger than the shapeshifter, he was at a disadvantage. The creature moved quickly, hiding behind trees. The shapeshifter had a unique skill, which is being able to move in complete darkness with its deep yellow eyes being tightly closed. Fesliyan reached for his pistol in his long black coat, slowly and carefully, trying to be as silent as ever. He was hoping just for a second the shapeshifter would open its eyes, thus revealing its position. And so it did. 4 shots fired, 2 hit the tree trunk, exploding the bark into a million pieces. 1 hit the ground and the other hit the shapeshifter's spider's leg. It winced in pain and gave an eerie shriek, just like the one from last night, before scurrying away. The shapeshifter climbed up, leaping from tree to tree, and then pounced on the vampire cop. The spider's legs were difficult to deal with, constantly stomping on the vampire as he dodged side to side while rolling on the ground. Fesliyan used his razor-sharp fingernails and wounded the same leg that he hit earlier. The shapeshifter lost its balance and fell as if the woodland ground was a slippery floor. The vampire continued his attack, using elbows and knees to further break down the creature's legs. Then he was temporarily blinded. The shapeshifter spat out a gooey-like substance into the vampire's eyes as he turned away. Fesliyan, however, could hear the creature loud and clear, moaning in pain, while he pointed his pistol blindly. The shapeshifter, realizing that it was too dangerous, scurried away in the dark night. But where would it go? Fesliyan Hunt wiped the gooey substance from his eyes and looked around the woods. No sign of the shapeshifter, both in sight and noise. The vampire composed himself, then walked carefully towards the farmhouse. He circled the house, looking on the ground for any tracks or footprints, and found none. Then he moved towards the front door, knocking 3 times while holding his pistol behind his back. Just as he was about to knock the 4th time, the door opened. A young woman with tears in her eyes opened the door. Fesliyan Hunt, with his polite mannerisms, introduced himself and then explained his purpose for the visit. The Redwater police force was looking for a suspect since last night. The woman gave a fake smile and in her shaky voice said no one was in the farmhouse. The vampire cop tried looking inside and she closed the door a bit more. He asked, "Ma'am, is everything okay?" The woman responded yes. Fesliyan Hunt understood what was going on. The shapeshifter was in the house, but he knew one wrong move and the woman could be in danger. Or could she? If the shapeshifter really wanted to kill her, why didn't he last night? The vampire cop held the woman's hand and ushered her behind him while he barged into the house, aiming his pistol at specific directions. "Come out," he said. "There was no point in hiding, nor do I believe that you could ever hurt this woman." The shapeshifter, as a young man with an untidy beard, slowly emerged from behind the passage, limping as he walked. The shot Fesliyan fired earlier in the woods had hit the shapeshifter right above the kneecap. While pointing the pistol at him, Fesliyan asked the woman if the intruder hurt her. She said no, he only frightened her last night when he barged into one of her windows while being a terrifying creature. The vampire cop was calm and collected, then told the woman to go upstairs. Everything was going to be okay and the suspect will be out of her home in no time. The woman listened and took safety in the upstairs bedroom. But at that moment, the shapeshifter looked at the clock, then back at Fesliyan, and pushed the vampire cop out the door. Fesliyan and the shapeshifter tussled outside, but in the bright light of the farmhouse, the creature had no chance. With every punch, elbow, and kick landed by the vampire cop, the shapeshifter changed into a variety of creatures, kind of like his body was failing. Finally, he accepted defeat and changed back into the man with the untidy beard. The birthmark was visible on his neck. Fesliyan kept his pistol away and crouched down to speak to the man. Fesliyan said, "What are you doing?" The shapeshifter backed up, absolutely terrified at the vampire cop's red eyes. "Just end me already," he said while his eyes remained closed. Fesliyan, however, had no intention of doing so. "Sir, calm down. I fired a shot to wound you, not to kill. You will heal, you're a shapeshifter. But your kind shouldn't be doing any of this. In all the witness reports, you never harmed a human. Come with me to the police station, let me vouch for you." The man sobbed uncontrollably. "No," he exclaimed, "you don't understand. My kind will never ever take me back after what I've done. Do you understand that? They will butcher me and use me as an example for anyone that defies their rule." "What rule? You haven't killed anyone. You haven't hurt anyone either. I know many shapeshifters, they are good people. They have worked so hard to build a reputation in Redwater for being genuine, honest folk. Please, sir, come with me." "No, why don't you understand? I got paid in gold. Gold coins, I say. Do you know how much of coin was given to me? Do you? No shapeshifter has or will ever see such money in their life. I got greedy. I turned to someone that I shouldn't have." The man kept looking at the clock outside the farmhouse. 1 minute to midnight. He was scared, antsy, and trembling with anxiety. Fesliyan Hunt looked at the clock and then back at the shapeshifter. His eyes became smaller as his forehead creased up. "What did you do?" At exactly midnight, the vampire's old phone rang. He removed it from his pocket and saw Captain Mill's number. "Captain," he said, "I have the suspect in custody, and I will be bringing him to the—"
"Hello, Inspector.
"Who is this?"
Don't you recognize me? We spoke before.
"Where is Laura Mills?"
You're not the one in charge, Mr. Vampire Cop. Everything was going so well. I sent you to Houndsville. The werewolves ambushed you, and if I am being honest, I thought you were much weaker, but I was wrong. So brave and strong that you defeated them all and hung them on trees with chains. So brutal. I loved it.
You're the one that killed Captain Langley.
Langley? My dear boy, I have destroyed so many people. Surely you do not expect me to stop and ask them their names. It seems the shapeshifter did his job. You know, they are quite dumb creatures to be honest, but hey, with the right amount of coin, even the foolish become smart. Well done to him for keeping you busy.
You so much as touch a hair on my captain and I will gut you like a fish.
Save your empty threats to yourself.
15 minutes past midnight. If you don't show up at the old church in Mainridge, this woman dies. This is all your fault. If the werewolves captured you, I would have your heart by now, and our ritual would have been completed. 15 minutes past midnight, not a minute later. You can enter with your heart in your hand, or we could rub it out of your chest. The choice is yours.
The crone had cut the call. Fesliyan Hunt looked angrier than ever. He knelt down and grabbed the shapeshifter by the collar and said, I still will not take your life as you haven't taken any others, as yet. But mark my words, I will tell every shapeshifter in Redwater what you have done. I will tell them how their entire efforts, blood, sweat, and tears just to fit into this world has been ruined by a fool of their kind in one night. And I pity your poor soul for what they are going to do to you. However, if by some miracle I see you in Redwater again, I can assure you the next time the bullet won't be aimed at your leg. It would be at this spot, right between your eyes. Fesliyan's fierce, fiery red eyes had substantiated everything that he had just said. The shapeshifter sobbed uncontrollably. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the fear for what the shapeshifters in Redwater were going to do to him. Or maybe it was the vampire cop's red eyes staring into his soul. Fesliyan ran at the speed of light in the dark, misty, cold night. So many thoughts racing through his mind. The crone has killed one of his captains already. There was no way that he was going to let another die. But his heart for Captain Mills. How is he gonna get out of this one? With 9 minutes to go, will the vampire cop make it in time? There was a village situated on the outskirts of Hounsville. Hailing Cove they had called it. A village filled with folk that worked so hard you would think they were machines. Folk that had nothing but worked for everything. It never mattered how much they earned or what job they would take on. Laughter, happiness, and dedication was an aroma that surrounded the entire village. However, a place that was once filled with the pleasant noises of getting through the ins and outs of life had now been replaced with an eerie silence. Despite the strong winds whistling through the village, despite the warm candlelit room shining through the windows, despite the heavy raindrops soaking the muddy ground, the quiet village could not hide the plague-like mist that lingered throughout. A monstrous beast with black fur walked slowly in Hailing Cove. There was something behind it being dragged by its arm, but the darkness refused to reveal any more. Then the bolt of lightning that struck behind the village shed more light. This was only for a mere second perhaps, but it was enough. There stood a tall creature with red eyes that appeared to be a werewolf, but moved like anything but. It had been dragging one of the villagers behind him as if the lifeless victim weighed less than a feather. The body was a pale, ghostly white with its skin like melted wax folded over its bones. The eye sockets were sunken in while the eyeballs dangled in front. The lips were blue, the veins dark black like tributaries on a map, and the body was cold to the touch. The two pointy fangs kept the monster's mouth from closing properly. Its long tongue licked its snout as it threw the body into the village river, like throwing a pillow. Then the second lightning flash revealed the horror that lied in front. There was a pile of bodies of every villager that occupied a home in Hailing Cove. The werewolf-like monster used its shoulder to shove the pile of bodies into the river, watching the strong current carry the villagers downstream. But from what seemed to be a werewolf had now become more complicated. The fur fell off its body like a snake shedding its skin like charcoal tightly wrapped around its long, slender, bony structure. Its eyes were glowing red in the night as it crouched to the ground like the monster was in pain. But then, the two large rings, dark like its skin, had pushed out from its spine and the monster had flown away into the night, never to be seen again. However, there was a villager that survived in Hailing Cove. There was a little boy that wore a bandit mask, waiting for his father to come home to play cowboys and outlaws with him. While he was hiding underneath a wooden pallet, his body was stricken with sheer grief and trembling with horror, watching his parents being dragged by this ominous beast. Once the monster flew away, the 9-year-old boy crawled out of the dirty mud with the rain masking the tears rolling down his face like mini floods. He walked aimlessly all the way to an old telephone booth near the Redwater train station. He fumbled in his old rags for clothes and found a penny given to him by his late father. He then inserted it into the coin slot of the phone, dialed the number, and in his quaky, wavering voice he says,
"Hello? Redwater Police Station? May I speak to Fesliyan Hunt, please? I am from the village of Hailing Cove and my parents have just been murdered."
Fesliyan Hunt was at the Redwater Medical and Rehabilitation Center. Fesliyan's body ran on fumes, but the reason for the visit was for someone else, Captain Laura Mills. It was unusual seeing Captain Mills with untidy long hair and eyes that appeared to be anything but focused. However, she was justified, since the captain had a near-death experience. With bandages around her neck, head, wrists, and back, her eyelids struggled to open as she saw Fesliyan sitting by her bedside, giving her that warm, charming, and comfortable smile that he wore so well. He said, "You need to rest, Captain. You were in a terrible accident." But while he said it, his eyes never met hers. For the first time in a long time, Fesliyan Hunt told a lie. This was the doctor's orders. Laura Mills was almost killed by Josephine, an old evil witch powerful beyond belief. The light brown-skinned woman hit her head so many times 2 nights ago that she had now been suffering from short-term memory loss. The vampire cop, while being able to rescue his captain and outsmart the crone, did not come out unscathed. The deep scar running down from his sternum to his abdomen and the constant limp in his left leg were wounds that, despite being a vampire, were not healing. Captain Mills said,
"Fesliyan, I keep having flashbacks of a dark basement and ropes tied to my hands."
Panic found his face as he looked behind him frantically. Thankfully, the nurses and the doctor stepped in, which in turn gave the vampire cop his cue to leave. How could he tell Captain Mills everything that happened? How could he tell her the crone was in fact the one that killed Captain Langley? How would he tell her that she wanted his heart for a foul ritual and managed to fool her by doing something so unlike his character? Nevertheless, the vampire smiled warmly and walked out, hiding the dilemma in his mind. It seemed like whoever knew Fesliyan was a vampire had been hunted or used against him. 7 p.m. and the vampire cop knew lying will get him nowhere. But by the end of the night, when Captain Mills gets discharged, he would tell her everything that happened. For now, he received a troublesome message on his pager. Come to the Redwater police station immediately. Fesliyan was worried. What if Anne-Marie conjured up one of her devious plans to make the vampire cop's life miserable? Maybe they found out he was a vampire. However, when he reached the station, he found the matter at hand to be much worse. There was a young boy that called in, stricken with so much of fear that he could barely speak. He said his parents were murdered from the village of Hailing Cove, Hounsville, and asked for Fesliyan specifically. This was no secret, he was well known in Hounsville. Most folk knew he was a vampire from Lullaby Town since the werewolf case. Fesliyan also knew they were good folk trying to make an honest living. Though, what troubled the vampire cop was the fact that the boy wasn't inside the station. It was dark, cold and rainy, and a child maybe 8 to 9 years of age by the voice was wandering around by his lonesome, scared as can be. Fesliyan set out at once while the other inspectors patrolled near the train station where the call was made. The vampire frantically looked around in the rain, making his way to the village of Hailing Cove, but also stopping bystanders to ask if they had seen the boy or heard anything from the village. With a troubled mind and a heavy heart, Fesliyan thought, maybe the boy got lost trying to find the Redwater police station. After all, folk in Hounsville did not have the means to travel. Fesliyan thought, what would he do if he got lost? Then he remembered that he would trace his steps back. Thus, Fesliyan Hunt made his way to the village of Hailing Cove in the pouring rain while the sky rumbled with thunder. He saw the lightning flashes as the thick clouds illuminated in the night sky, lighting up his eyes. He took a deep breath in to calm his nerves and said, "Kid, wherever you are, just hold on tight." The vampire cop had entered the village of Hailing Cove in search for the young boy. He felt the air unclean and the presence of an ominous monster that left shortly before. However, this investigation was different from the others. There was nothing for him to go on. The surrounding towns and village folk mentioned hearing no screams or anything untoward from Hailing Cove. Although they did say the village was way too quiet. Now Fesliyan had understood why, since the village was empty. The only witness to the murders was a kid that he could not find. Fesliyan was always in control of any situation dealing with the foulest of creatures, but for the first time the vampire cop felt an emptiness surrounding his chest. He began searching for the child while carrying out his investigation. The heavy rain drenched his long black coat as he walked slowly in the village. His black steel-toed boots were messed by the splashes of mud puddles. His eyes then glowed red as if he was a robot, scanning the area to find what the normal eye could not see. Then on the ground he found werewolf footprints, but how strange was this, that despite the prints being large, they were certainly not heavy. Was this a werewolf so slender that it weighed less than the average human? Or perhaps a werewolf that moved like a vampire? Then he crouched on the ground, unbothered by the dirt splashing on his clothes, and saw tracks of people being dragged and streaks of blood painted on the ground of Hailing Cove. While he remained in the crouching position, the vampire did a dark walk that became a crawl. He followed the tracks and noticed something even more troubling. Why didn't the people run away? Why were there tracks leading from their homes and yet nothing towards the exit of the village? The village folk walked but never ran. None of them tried escaping. When he stood up, he felt a surge of pain in his left leg and a sharp stabbing sensation in his chest. Nor could he breathe properly with the thick fog surrounding the village. What exactly did the crone do to him that did not allow his wounds to heal? There were too many houses in the village, and even with Fesliyan's speed, he barely explored half of it. However, he noticed the black fur was also on the wooden floors in many of the homes. He thought to himself, no signs of forceful entry, then how did the werewolf-like creature enter their homes? Maybe the village folk opened their doors for it. But why would they ever do such a thing? Nevertheless, he followed the tracks leading to the river, a long windy river supplying the people of Hailing Cove with water. The tracks, however, ended at the riverbank. He watched the current flowing fast and hard, bending at each curve of the land. He thought, while werewolves were monsters with unique powers and strengths, swimming was not one of them. But where did the river lead to, and how did the werewolf-like creature leave the village? He looked around to see if anyone was nearby before climbing up the rooftops, so quickly that if one blinked, they would miss it. The old roof tiles were damaged and had scratch marks from thin sharp nails rather than claws. Fesliyan soared from rooftop to rooftop, seeing a trail of blood that disappeared into the night. This told him the monster was either wounded by the villagers or had already been hurt. It also told him the creature could jump and move like a werewolf, but the feathers resembled the wings shared with vampires from Cascada. The vampire cop touched the spot of blood with his fingers, then tasted it. Without hesitation, Fesliyan spat it out. The taste of blood of a living person compared to that of a deceased might not seem like much of a difference, but to a vampire, the difference was night and day. Blood gas is determined by various factors, such as oxygen, carbon dioxide, and pH. But since the above will be non-existent for a deceased person, the taste of blood for a vampire can easily be distinguished. However, that would mean the creature was—
Excuse me, sir, but what do you think you are doing on the rooftop of that house? Please do not tell me you were trying to break in.
There was a voice that echoed beneath Fesliyan as he carelessly climbed back down, just to show that that was the way he climbed up. The mystery continued yet again. Fesliyan's hearing was unmatched, heightened to such an extent that he could hear a person's heartbeat. So where did this young man wearing a white lab coat come from? The vampire cop flipped his badge open, then told him this was an investigation. The young man introduced himself as Miguel, the village doctor that does his nightly checkups. Then at that moment, down the village, a squeaky wooden door opened up and a 9-year-old boy walked out. He looked dehydrated and starved, wobbling as he walked. It also seemed like he had a long way back to Hailing Cove just to seek shelter from not knowing where the Redwater police station was. He saw the vampire cop and his eyes widened. The child tried to talk, but no voice had left his throat. He was so traumatized that his old pants got wet from emptying his bladder. The trembling started again as the boy had a seizure. Fesliyan ran and held the child while the doctor removed an injection from his suitcase.
Wait, what are you doing?
The vampire cop asked. The doctor replied that it was a sedative. The boy was having a PTSD episode. This will help calm his nerves and get him the rest that he deserves. Fesliyan said PTSD.
Yes, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a mental health condition caused by witnessing an extremely terrifying or disturbing event. Memories of trauma, nightmares, flashback, etc. Please, I need to administer this right away.
Fesliyan said, sure, go ahead, but if this kid doesn't wake up, these handcuffs will be wrapped around your wrist. Dr. Miguel gave a warm professional smile and injected the boy as his eyes closed like a dim light, finally coming to rest. Fesliyan Hunt then called one of his colleagues from the station to have the child taken and treated at the Redwater Medical Center, where Captain Mills was admitted. Fesliyan asked Dr. Miguel, since you visit here frequently, where does the river lead to? Miguel replied,
Oh, it's a long river, Inspector, and never have I pursued it. Especially with the current being this rapid, we cannot travel by boat. Though I do have a vehicle that we could use. Please, Inspector, I would like to do anything that can help with your investigation and find out what happened to my patient.
Fesliyan Hunt accompanied the doctor to his vehicle while constantly turning back. What was really going on in the village of Hailing Cove? What was this eerie, mysterious fog that hovered in the air? Was there even one monster to begin with, and if there was, judging by the footprint, a creature so large could be heard or seen a mile away, then why didn't they run? Why did they not see the onslaught coming? Why were they quiet? But more importantly, if they were dumped into the river as the tracks displayed, then where does the river lead to? The vampire and Dr. Miguel reached their destination. The bottom of the river led to a morgue that never showed up on any map in Hauntsville. Fesliyan has seen many things in his long life, but this made him throw up. The foul stench and the horrific sight of corpses heaped up like garbage. He recognized the clothes and knew immediately these were the people from Hailing Cove. The victims looked like melted wax completely drained of their blood, with their brains removed. Dr. Miguel stood in horror as words could not find his tongue. The lights were on in the morgue, but there was no movement from the inside. Fesliyan walked towards the front door, chained and locked. Just as he was going to kick the door open, Dr. Miguel stopped him. "Hold on, Inspector," he said. "The good thing about being a call-out doctor is we have the keys to every medical center. Just give me a minute." He fumbled with a large ring of keys for a very long time before opening the morgue door. The vampire cop walked in and saw experimental equipment for blood transfusions. There were countless of test tubes, operating tables, and a glass cabinet filled with human brains. Then there was an article on the wall of a medical doctor being fired more than 65 years ago for malpractice in hallucinogens, although the article did not have any names or locations listed. Dr. Miguel walked around the morgue with his eyes wide open from the horror that he witnessed. Who would do such a thing? He had asked. Then at that moment, the vampire cop's old phone rang. He recognized the number coming from Captain Mills. "Captain, you are supposed to be resting. I am currently
Fesliyan, listen to me. The kid is sitting next to me right now. He tried to tell you earlier. Fesliyan, the doctor is the hybrid. It's the must. He drugged the people of Hailing Cove. That's why they couldn't see him. Get out of there now."
What was this eerie, mysterious fog that hovered in the air? Bandit masks, no signs of forceful entry. Then how did the werewolf-like creature enter their homes? Maybe the village folk opened their doors for it. But why would they ever do such a thing? The village doctor that does his nightly checkups. But since the above will be non-existent for a deceased person, a medical doctor being fired more than 65 years ago for malpractice in hallucinogens, the bottom of the river led to a morgue that never showed up on any map in Hauntsville. The good thing about being a call-out doctor is we have the keys to every medical center. The child tried to talk, but no voice had left his throat. The vampire cop slowly turned around and looked at the mirror towards his right. While hallucinogens may alter perception of the eyes, the mirror showed Dr. Miguel's true reflection. Fesliyan saw an eerie, tall, slender werewolf-vampire hybrid with sharp fangs and glowing red eyes. The doctor then said,
"We can do this the hard way or the easy way, Inspector. Join us. This is what Anne-Marie wanted. I was a vampire just like you once upon a time, but I was weak. Heightened speed, heightened senses, but where was the power? Where was the strength? I became ridiculed, fired from my job all those years ago, and the only one that saved me was Anne-Marie. She wants to make you our leader. She wants you to be the strongest hybrid the world will ever see. We have so much of blood now. So many bodies to experiment on. We have hideouts at every location in the land. Join us, Inspector. We are the winning team."
Rage filled the vampire's eyes as it turned red. His fangs pushed out while he could feel his blood boiling. He clenched his fist so tight that his hands turned paler than its usual color. Fesliyan charged at the hybrid, pushing him so hard they broke through the side wall of the morgue. He threw so many punches with such speed, his hands looked like blurs moving against the wind. But yet, not one punch landed. The hybrid grabbed Fesliyan by the throat and tossed him aside like he was nothing.
"You are wounded, Inspector. You're slow. You're weak and pathetic. Lord Dracula did say you will put up a fight."
The vampire got up to his feet and limped on his left leg. He felt 100 razors cutting his chest from the wounds inflicted 2 nights ago. The hybrid was correct. Fesliyan Hunt at this moment was indeed weak. The hybrid and the vampire fought, with Fesliyan taking the worst beating that he has ever received. He kept getting up. He knew this time that he was outmatched. Hybrids moved faster than bullets, but this hybrid was on a different level altogether. Such strength, such power and speed. Ragnar the White Wolf himself would struggle. However, the werewolf-vampire hybrid was unaware of what Fesliyan was trying to do. He was baffled as to why the vampire cop kept getting up to his feet every time that he was knocked down. The fight moved closer and closer towards the river. The storm louder than it ever was, and the night seemed much darker than before. Fesliyan stood at the edge of the riverbank. His leg trembled with pain and he coughed out so much of blood from all the hits that he had taken. The hybrid walked confidently, with his red eyes staring into Fesliyan's soul.
Well,
He said,
I tried. If you will not join us, I do have to kill you. Such a pity, Inspector. We would have made a really good team.
"You're an idiot."
What did you say?
I said, "You're an idiot. You may be able to move and fight like me. Your strength may tower mine, but there's one thing you're forgetting. You cannot swim." The hybrid's eyes widened with the sudden realization of what the vampire cop was trying to do. Fesliyan latched onto the hybrid in a bear hug, swirled his body around and submerged both him and the monster deep into the river. Now the playing field was leveled. All that speed and all that power was useless underwater. Fesliyan, with blood in his mouth, smiled at the hybrid, watching his lungs collapse. When the hybrid stopped struggling, Fesliyan dragged the monster's body out of the river. In pain and exhaustion, something the vampire cop was not used to, he dragged the hybrid monster using the long way back to Redwater, through the woods. Fesliyan walked into the ward Captain Mills was in. His hair was messy, his clothes muddy, and he could barely stand. He saw Laura feeding her dinner to the 9-year-old boy that stared into oblivion. "Is he going to be okay?"
I guess. I called my sister. She said she'll take care of him until we find him a good home. You look like crap, Fesliyan.
"Well, I look better than I feel."
Did you manage to catch him?
"Yeah."
Go home and rest, Inspector. I was going to ask you what happened 2 nights ago. My memory comes and goes and there are pieces missing. But maybe tomorrow, okay?
"That night, Captain,
That's an order, Inspector. You are on leave, effective immediately. Fesliyan, you are not okay and I don't know what's going on. But for now, you need to recover."
The vampire cop walked home just before sunrise. The pain in his left leg was now at an all-time high. He opened the door of his wooden cabin, locked it behind him, and then made his way downstairs to the basement. The werewolf-vampire hybrid, Dr. Miguel, sat on a wooden chair restrained with chains. Fesliyan took a deep breath in as he threw his long black coat onto a wooden table near his library. He limped his way to the arsenal of weapons hanging on the wall. At first, the silver axes and knives did look tempting, but he opted for something else. The vampire cop removed an old hammer with hooks on the sides from the rack above, then grabbed a jar of rusty nails, some straight and others bent. He told the hybrid, "You're going to tell me everything you know, or you're going to wish that I drowned you in that river." The vampire cop sat in his cozy wooden cabin, blood bag in hand, sipping away as he told Captain Mills everything that he knew. Laura Mills was Fesliyan's new captain in the Redwater police station since Captain Langley was murdered. Captain Mills was captured not too long ago by an evil witch, the Crones as the supernatural world called them. Fesliyan rescued Captain Mills, an incident she had no memory of, while not exiting that building unscathed. The Crones needed the vampire's heart for a ritual, a foul ritual to awaken a beast that will stop the grey werewolf Victor Humbridge from completing the werewolf trials. The evil witch gave the vampire cop an ultimatum: surrender willingly with his heart as an offering to her, or she will take it herself and kill Captain Moles being held hostage. Fesliyan had stooped so low by taking the heart of one of the hybrids he slew a few weeks ago in Anne-Marie's dungeon. He used his 6-inch razor-sharp nails and made a slit in his chest, inserting the hybrid's heart inside. This was a failsafe just to buy him some time to save Captain Moles. When he reached the old church building, his captain was suspended in the air by a long rope. She had been wounded with cuts and bruises seemingly caused by the crone's nails. Vampires were quick, much faster than werewolves. Fesliyan dashed forward, cut the rope, releasing Captain Moles. The crone, however, as old as she was, matched his speed and pinned him against the wall. Her blue old rag-like hooded cloak could not mask the evil, petrifying, rotting face hidden beneath. Her large eyes had maggots crawling out of them, and in that futile moment the vampire cop could not tell which was more frightening, the way that she looked or how strong these crones really were. The crone then impaled the vampire's chest with her slender forearm and dug out his heart, or so she thought. Fesliyan, seemingly playing dead, fell to his knees next to Captain Moles. With his droopy eyes, he witnessed the crone placing the heart into a cauldron while speaking in a foul language. In her short-lived success, she boasted about how she disguised herself to Captain Langley as a young, helpless woman being chased by monsters at night. Fesliyan felt immense guilt after hearing that, knowing Captain Langley would have been hidden from the world of monsters if he never revealed his identity in the first place. Once she got closer to Captain Langley, the crone placed her hands on his head and dug her nails into his skull, stealing all the memories that he had. She copied his mannerisms, speech, and everything else needed to make that call to Fesliyan hunt, sending him to hunt werewolves in Lullaby Town. But then, when the crone developed her concoction inside the cauldron, the ritual backfired and exploded in her face, sending the evil witch flying across the room. She never knew that it was the hybrid heart she used, not the vampires. Fesliyan used this opportunity to grab Captain Moles with the remaining power left in his body, fleeing from the old church building. However, since that day his power has been fading away. Maybe the crone's dark magic caused a defect in his blood. He felt weaker, slower, filled with worry and despair. He kept thinking about how disadvantaged he was to fight Anne-Marie and the hybrids, not forgetting the terrifying Dracula and the mind games he had in store for him. Why were they targeting Fesliyan Hunt? What latent power was hidden deep within the vampire that even the crones showed interest in him? These questions would soon be answered. Once he bid farewell to Captain Moles, he made his way down to the basement. The werewolf-vampire hybrid was tied to a wooden chair with holes in his body. The vampire cop used a 4-pound hammer and knocked wooden stakes into every limb of the hybrids. This was a brutal, horrific way of extracting information, but Fesliyan felt no remorse. This creature murdered an entire village. He got what he deserved. Fesliyan then donned his long black coat and made his way to Mrs. Armonai's house. Mrs. Armonai was an Indian woman, the Redwater veterinarian and the first human to know about Fesliyan's secret. They had an agreement that the vampire feeds on the blood of animals who have recently been deceased from old age or wounds that could not be treated. It still hurt Fesliyan to do this, of course, but it was better than feeding off humans. Fesliyan Hunt tried his best to live a normal life, to try and be as human as possible. But when he fetched the blood bags from Mrs. Armonai, he never realized what was going on behind his back. More specifically, inside the Redwater police station. The Redwater police station was busy as ever. There have been many reports over the last 24 hours of strange sightings in the city. Some say werewolves while others say vampires, but neither of them would be incorrect. The city folks' eyes did not deceive them, for these creatures roaming around at night, sneaking into the woods, were hybrids. Normally, reports like these would be discarded, but ever since the inspectors worked with Fesliyan Hunt, they felt like maybe there was some truth in these claims. Maybe this world did have monsters living among humans, frightening creatures of the night that knew how to hide in plain sight. With so many witness reports flooding the precinct, people young and old, small and big, had queued up at the tables waiting for their say. Julian, however, the balding middle-aged inspector that turned down the captain position 6 times, and Felicia, Fesliyan's colleagues, had their eyes fixed on the 2 people that just walked in. Something was different about this couple. They dressed the same way that Fesliyan did, long coats, brimmed hats, and steel-tipped boots. They walked slowly, confidently, and in sync with each other. Julian thought they may be husband and wife, but when they spoke to Felicia, they introduced themselves as siblings. "We are looking for an inspector that works here," they said. Fesliyan Hunt is his name. Felicia and Julian looked at each other, then back at the siblings. They told them his shift never started yet, but they would be more than happy to write down their reports, then hand it to him when he arrives. The siblings backed away from the table. The woman leaned against another while the man clapped his hands together. His brimmed hat, even while talking, revealed little to no information about his facial features, but one thing was certain: they had deep scars on their skin. Julian also noticed the heavy weapons inside the coat. Stakes, crossbows, knives, silver chains. Why would someone need those things? The man shouted like he was gathering customers to his newspaper stand, then said, "Ladies and gentlemen of Redwater, we are looking for a man, an inspector that works here." The woman then held up a poster of Fesliyan's face. "Handsome, is he not?" "Oh yes, handsome indeed. Apparently, he's been working here for a few years, working the night shift, solving cases, and getting a paycheck at the end of the day. Now, whether this is guilt or a heart of gold, but we found out that he donates his monthly paychecks to orphanages and hospitals. Awfully strange behavior for a vampire, wouldn't you say?" Every single person in the police station gasped. Murmurs of horror filled the room, with the other inspectors looking at the poster in sheer confusion and panic. Julian and Felicia, however, were angry. They frowned at the couple, eager to know who they were. Of all the people Fesliyan worked with, why did these 2 colleagues seem unfazed by this news? Why didn't their facial expression budge? Then at that moment, Captain Mills, in her uniform, bandaged arm and stitched neck, walked into the precinct. Her hair neatly tied and as much pain as she may have been in, no one would have guessed she came out of hospital. She looked at Julian and Felicia, then at the mysterious couple standing in front of her. They walked towards Captain Mills. They towered over her, and only at that moment their heights were distinguishable. However, Laura Mills was short, so it was difficult to tell. The tall man grinned under his brimmed hat, letting out a deep, coarse giggle, while the woman handed Captain Mills their card. She says, "We're vampire hunters." And as if things couldn't get any worse, Dracula in the woods of Redwater had awakened. He pushed away the giant tree logs on his chest, making it seem like they weighed less than a feather. 5 days have gone by since he regained consciousness from being knocked out by Death himself. It was a blink, just a mere blink from the Grim Reaper that sent the higher vampire flying across the woods. Flair Tepish was angrier than ever. His ego took a thrashing more than his body. He could heal the wounds, but how does one remove the stain tainted on his pride? He looked up into the night sky while listening attentively. He heard the hybrids gathering in their respective locations around the city. Everything was still going according to his plan, and at midnight he will set them loose onto the city of Redwater. However, where was Anne-Marie? Anne-Marie stood outside Fesliyan's home. The vampire walked towards the vampiress, ready to rip out her throat. But she was smart. She arrived exactly at 8 p.m., knowing fully well the train made its stop and Fesliyan would not risk innocent souls being caught in the crossfire. He ground his teeth and clenched his fist in anger. "What do you want?" he asks furiously. Anne-Marie was different than before. She wasn't arrogant or conceited. Her face, while pale, never looked so evil at this moment. It's almost like Fesliyan spoke to the woman that he once knew, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Fenwick, who was always lost and afraid. "Join us," she told him. She confessed on how none of this was the way that she wanted it to be. She cared for Fesliyan, and even though it's been more than 70 years, her memories of the past life never diminished. Anne-Marie mentioned how the hybrids would be set loose onto the city of Redwater. Blood will be spilled in Fesliyan's name, and he could stop it if he surrendered to Dracula, if he joined their army, if he became a loyal servant to the cause. She told Fesliyan that he had until midnight to make his choice. Her face was indeed filled with remorse, but when Fesliyan began talking, that evil nature she hid so well found her face once more. "How would your parents feel if they saw you this way, Marie?"
My parents are dead. Dead people don't feel anything.
"And you served the vampire that killed them. Have you no memory of what he did to our village?"
Lord Dracula has saved me. He showed me a life that I dreamt of.
"And what happened to your parents' dreams?"
My parents sold me, Fesliyan. They wanted me gone the moment my marriage proposal arrived. Are you sure we're talking about the same people here? They sold me.
"Sold you? Sold you? You've got some nerve, Marie. We lived in a time where women were only looked upon to do chores in the village, to be maids, servants, to be nothing more. Your father worked more jobs than I could count to save up for your dowry. Mrs. Fenwick starved herself just to feed you. You would have had a life, Marie, away from that hellhole. You would have been married into a good family, a good husband that respected you, not to use you or look down upon you. You know, I'm glad they didn't live long enough to see their daughter this way. You make me sick." Anne-Marie took a moment to speak. It hurt. It really hurt, but she hid it well. The only thing that she told Fesliyan was midnight, the woods near Central Town not a minute later. Then she walked away. Fesliyan called out to her, "You tell your lord and tell him well. I will take on his hybrids myself, and when I'm done, both of you are next." As Anne-Marie turned back to Fesliyan, his eyes were glowing red and his fangs pushed out. "One more thing," he said. "You may be smitten over his charm since he was the one that turned you, but make no mistake. I cannot forgive you for experimenting on those innocent people. I have buried you before, and I will bury you again, and I will put you back into that grave. Permanently this time." And so the midnight hour loomed over the heads of vampires, werewolves, hybrids, and humans alike. Midnight would decide their fate. Fesliyan was so angry with his words that maybe Anne-Marie felt a sense of fear. Maybe she felt the vampire cop was indeed strong enough to slay the hybrids, but Fesliyan knew that that was a lie. Whatever the crone did to him, he barely was able to fight one of them, let alone an army. As people boarded the train, Fesliyan took a deep breath in. For a while he contemplated, and his face looked like he was having an internal dilemma. The hybrids were stronger than him, faster, more agile, and fiercer. But he was thankful that Anne-Marie never entered his home. The vampire cop with wavering strength did have an advantage. With the information extracted from the hybrid doctor that he tortured in his basement, he now knew of easier ways to kill them. He spent the remaining time in his basement, filling his long black coat with weapons, knives, daggers, silver chains, crossbows, wooden stakes, and shrapnel contraptions that looked like marbles, smaller and easier to carry. He grabbed the wooden stake that he'd been keeping for years. This one in particular would be used to kill Dracula, once and for all. Though when the night fell silent, too silent, Fesliyan knew something bad was going to happen. Once the clock struck 10 p.m., he heard footsteps walking up to his wooden porch. The first set was heavy and strong. It had to be a large man indeed. The second set was softer, more elegant and fluid. And when they called out to him, the vampire cop knew immediately who it was. Inspector Julian and Felicia. When Fesliyan rushed upstairs, tidying up the wooden basement in panic, he met them at the door. Warm greetings and embraces were put on hold. They barged in and shut the door behind them. They never walked on eggshells, not when 2 hours remained for the Redwater massacre. Julian and Felicia had gradually changed their appearance from human to peculiar creatures. Julian was a large, bulky, bold green creature with a muscular body except for his enormous stomach. His mouth looked like an upside-down smile and his feet looked like an ogre's. Felicia changed into a wolf-like creature. Her dark brown skin and slender body remained, and hair that looked more like fur. Her snout and ears were pointy and her nails long and sharp. The vampire cop backed away, knocking down the wooden table. His eyes glowed red and his fangs pushed out, ready to attack these intruders. He yelled repeatedly, "What did he do with Julian and Felicia?" However, these so-called intruders remained calm. They held their hands out and spoke softly, reassuringly, trying to defuse the situation, just the way they've done as inspectors. "It's still us," they told him. "They were shapeshifters. Have been for a very long time." They've suspected Fesliyan was a vampire for a while. His pale skin, the strange behavior of not eating, constantly skipping daily meetings, taking on bizarre cases that would otherwise be discarded. The signs were there. That was the reason Julian and Felicia worked the night shift with him, helping him keep his secret while maintaining their own. This was the first time they stumbled upon a vampire trying to do good for the city. Then they took a liking to him. Julian turned down the captain position because of his condition. It was too risky, too many lies and secrets with not enough courage to keep it up. Their suspicion of Fesliyan Hunt confirmed itself when he spared the shapeshifter that double-crossed him a few weeks ago. Shapeshifters in Redwater were always treated poorly. Therefore, when they experience any form of kindness, they send word out about the human or creature that helped them. Fesliyan paused for a moment. He realized what it felt like having a secret kept from him. He realized how it must have felt for the people that he constantly lied to, making excuses that he was ill rather than admitting the truth. But he understood why Julian and Felicia kept it hidden. Shapeshifters, when exposed, much like witches, were burned at the stake. The shapeshifter inspectors warned Fesliyan about the vampire hunters that barged into the precinct. The vampire's first question was if they hurt anyone. Not once was he ever worried about himself, but his concern for others always came first. Felicia said no, but they exposed him as a vampire. Julian also mentioned how he never saw them around before. He was an old shapeshifter, and shapeshifters remember everyone they see. They were definitely not from around Redwater or any surrounding towns, villages, and cities. Oh, they were bounty hunters, all right, the best of their kind. The way they walked, moved, the weapons they carried under the coats, they were professionals. But if they wanted Fesliyan dead, they would have paid him a visit instead of the police station. The vampire hunters wanted to cause panic. They wanted Fesliyan's secret exposed to the Redwater police force. But why? And who were they working for? Fesliyan thanked his friends, still in awe of the fact that they were shapeshifters, though he wasn't angered or held hatred towards them. In fact, he respected them more for being vulnerable by showing him who they really were. They knew about the Midnight Massacre going to take place, but never about the dealings of hybrids and Dracula. Shapeshifters get word of something and act with immediate effect. Julian and Felicia have managed to discreetly evacuate towns and villages with only Central Town remaining. They said the folk there were stubborn and wouldn't budge no matter how much they tried. Fesliyan acknowledged this. Central Town had the largest population. By no means would defending it be easy. Before the shapeshifters could explain why they couldn't stay and help, Fesliyan already knew and embraced them warmly. This wasn't their fight. Werewolves, vampires, hybrids, and Marie, this was all because of him, and he would never ask them to fight. Shapeshifters in Redwater were not warriors. They stayed away from bloodshed and conflict. They had children, families, responsibilities, something Fesliyan dreamed of having. He bid them farewell and told them that he would be seeing them around. With 1.5 hours remaining, Fesliyan the vampire cop, armed and ready, made his way towards the largest woods of Redwater. Dracula stood tall and strong, talking to the hybrids Anne Marie had nurtured. The vampiress stood towards his left, deep in thought and silent as ever. However, towards Dracula's right stood a vampire that looked different from any other. Mercer. This vampire creature was slightly younger than Vlad Tepes, serving Dracula as his right-hand man. He looked peculiar in a frightening way. Large and muscular, his face looked pointy like a bat, and his skin tight and pale. His teeth were long and sharp, and his eyes blood-red like Fesliyan's. Anne Marie seemed afraid of him, perhaps more so than she was of Dracula. Mercer also wore a furry coat, however the fur wasn't evenly colored. This vampire was a werewolf hunter and rumored to have fought special class werewolves before. Whenever he killed them, he would rip out a chunk of their fur with his fist and stick it on his coat. More than werewolves, Mercer was known as the torturer of mankind. The people chained up in Dracula's dungeon was his doing. But Mercer, Dracula, and Anne Marie have been living in the shadows far too long. So long that many believed they were myths. Spooky tales told around the campfire. Now, with a hybrid experimentation done right, Dracula's cause would come to life. Fesliyan thought it would be a massacre of Redwater, but that's not entirely true. Mercer, Anne Marie, and the hybrids would be turning every man, woman, and child into vampires by the next sunrise. With roars, grunts, hisses, and howls, with bats flapping their wings in the dark woods at night, 15 minutes remained for the go-ahead in storming every town, village, and city in Redwater. 120 hybrids, 2 masterful and extremely powerful vampires, and Dracula himself would see victory tonight. However, when marbles bounced around in their congregation, the smell of victory was snatched away. The marbles behaved like shrapnel magnets, drawing themselves towards the hybrids' heads. But just before impact, the marbles exploded and tiny nails pierced through their brains. 25 hybrids died with one throw, and when the rest turned behind, they saw Fesliyan Hunt standing a great distance away, with only the moonlight outlining him. Mercer hissed as his fangs popped out, but Dracula held his hand out, calming him down. This was no ordinary vampire they would be up against. This was Fesliyan Hunt, the vampire cop who was smart enough to stand far away to avoid his footsteps and movements being heard, as well as his scent from latching onto the noses of the hybrids. Dracula commanded the hybrids to leave immediately, and so the foul creatures did, making their way towards Central Town. He looked at Anne Marie in anger. It was her job to convince the vampire cop to join them. She put her head down, knowing she was going to die for her failure. But then Dracula felt a moment of panic. The vampire cop reached inside his coat and threw a wooden stake at lightning speed towards Dracula's heart. It was so quick, packed with so much of force, that Dracula never heard it. Luckily for him, Mercer held his hand out in front of Dracula's chest, having the wooden stake impale the center of his palm. Fesliyan vanished into a wisp of dark smoke traveling in the air, catching up to the hybrids. Mercer noticed this and said,
He can move as dark smoke traveling against the wind. I only know of one other vampire who used to do that.
Dracula looked at Mercer and said, "And that is why we cannot kill him. Not yet, at least. We need that latent power within. We need to find out why he shares similar abilities to the vampire elder." Ah yes, Dracula should deem himself lucky, lying about being the oldest vampire, for there was another, and he was the first. Only depicted in books, they call him Nazduk. A tall, slender, pale, bald man that wore an outfit like a priest. Every skill, appendage, behavioral pattern, speed and strength was passed down to the vampire bloodline because of him. No one knows just how old he really is, but one book mentioned him knowing Monrog when the Hellhound was just a pup. For most of his life he lived in a cave isolated from humanity. Some say he abducted humans now and again to feed on them. This was most likely true and far from being a rumor, since their bodies were found outside the cave with their skin looking like melted plastic. Those who chose to investigate the cave never returned. Though it is quite fascinating, of all the vampires that exist in the world, Fesliyan Hunt was the only one that could travel as dark smoke. Dracula could turn into red smoke or mist, but never dark. Just like the Grim Reaper, dark smoke had indicated a power level that was beyond comparison. Fascinating indeed. Mercer and Dracula vanished into the night, leaving Anne-Marie alone in the woods. She knew that this was her last chance. If she couldn't stop Fesliyan Hunt, Dracula would end her life in a heartbeat. However, they left for another reason. How easy it would be for the powerful Dracula and ruthless Mercer to kidnap the vampire cop. They chose to flee because they could sense someone or something approaching. It was no werewolf or animal, rather another vampire so strong Dracula felt the pressure pressing down on his shoulders. Anne-Marie sensed this as well. Her large black wings opened up from the rhomboid minors in her back. She lunged in the air and flew ahead just as quick as Fesliyan, defying a direct order from the higher vampire she chose to serve. Maybe she was afraid of that creature approaching. Maybe this was her way out. Maybe Anne-Marie, and all the evil that she had done, never wanted Fesliyan to die. Like a predator hunting its prey, Fesliyan began chasing down the hybrids on foot. These creatures were test subjects. They couldn't think for themselves, which worked in the vampire's favor. For now, they were solely fixated on entering Central Town and begin turning victims into hybrids. Fesliyan used this opportunity to run behind them, using his long razor-sharp nails and impaling their brains. The hybrids felt like a switch being turned off in their head. The others, however, were almost at the entrance of the town. Before the vampire knew it, people were being abducted from their homes like ragdolls. The hybrids began biting their necks and tossing them onto the ground. Everything happened too quickly, even for a vampire as fast as Fesliyan. He tried his best, fighting them off, dashing forward like a blur, moving from house to house. He yelled for people to evacuate while being torn apart by the hybrids. They ripped out flesh from his back, arms, neck, and chest. They wounded him faster than he could heal. And still, Fesliyan stood his ground. He fought with everything he had. While being covered in blood with wounds too deep to heal, he crawled on the ground and wiped his eyes. Not once did he ever doubt if this was a mistake. He always believed there were good people in this world, and with his blood-smudged eyes, he saw that in his final moments. Some townsfolk were trying to re-enter the town to save Fesliyan, but how could they possibly save a vampire? They were merely human. Their strength and speed were nothing compared to his, but still they tried. He smiled. Fesliyan finally felt like a human. He felt like those people, knowing the odds were against him, but still choosing to fight for what was right. With 50 hybrids remaining, decreasing in numbers, Fesliyan Hunt, as bloody and weak as ever, fought with all his heart. He used every skill he knew, decreasing their numbers, but a shocking turn of events had occurred. The last hybrid broke Fesliyan's arms at the elbow and shoulder joints respectively. The vampire witnessed the hybrid running towards a little boy, ready to snatch him away. He sprinted towards the creature, tackling it with his hurt shoulder. How was he going to kill the hybrid when their brains needed to be impaled? With panic and sheer desperation, he sunk his sharp fangs into the creature's head. But then the hybrid died and the town was dead silent. Fesliyan rolled over on his back, blood in his mouth, taking deep breaths. And then he began changing. His teeth grew longer and sharper. His nails became claws. His spine felt like it was bending and twisting with every breath he took. He woke up from the ground, stumbling with how much of pain he was in. Large wings popped out from his back and the vampire cop roared like a monster. His face was paler than usual and dark veins consumed his skin. And so the Vampire Cop Season 1 comes to an end with Fesliyan Hunt turning into a frightening, despicable and ruthless vampire monster flying away into the misty night with only his hisses and roars echoing throughout the town.